In December of 1988, a young woman was having coffee at her friend's house in the city of Tours, France, and at some point, she excused herself to go use the bathroom. And when she opened the lid of the toilet, she saw in the bowl were two small gold objects floating in the water. They looked like beads at first, or maybe broken pieces of jewelry, and so she leaned down close to get a better look. And then she realized what they actually were. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please ask the like button to go get a matching tattoo with you. But after they finish getting theirs done, just leave without getting yours. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the night of December 11th, 1988, a 38-year-old woman named Françoise Gendron touched up her lipstick in the bathroom mirror of a nightclub in the city of Tours, France. Her best friend, Sylvie Riverigo, was washing her hands at the sink right next to her. Françoise and Sylvie were best friends. They had basically known each other forever, since they were just little kids. And these days, they went out together almost every single night. They were both divorced, and Françoise's 19-year-old son had recently moved out of the house, so she was making the most of her new freedom and staying out late all the time, often with Sylvie. Now, Françoise and Sylvie were not exactly the same in terms of, their attitude towards life. Françoise had always been much more sociable and had this huge circle of friends, and so really she was the one who often had to push her much more introverted friend Sylvie to come out with her, but she usually did. However, tonight, it was Françoise who turned to Sylvie and said that she actually wanted to go home now. She told Sylvie that the men they were there with at the club, Michel and Luc, were making her feel uncomfortable, and she wanted to leave. Now, it was clear to Françoise pretty much immediately that Sylvie was pretty disappointed. Despite being introverted, now that they were out, Sylvie wanted to stay out. And also, they regularly went out with Michel and Luc, and there was never any issues before, and so she said as much to Françoise, like, what do you mean? Like, what's the issue? But Françoise just said she was getting a weird vibe from both of them and just would feel better if she went home. And so a few minutes later, Françoise and Sylvie walked back to the table where Michel and Luc were still sitting, and there was a receipt on the table, and Michel was putting his wallet away, like he had just paid for it. And actually, Michel, he turned to the women and he said, hey, are you guys ready to leave and go to the next club? But Françoise, she just kind of smiled and grabbed her coat and said that actually she was going to leave now. She said she had to get home to her boyfriend, who was probably already at her apartment and waiting for her. The men were pretty surprised by this, and maybe even a little bit offended. And Michel actually asked Françoise, like, hey, are you sure everything's okay here? Like, is that really the reason you're leaving? And Françoise just said, yep, everything's fine. I just gotta go. But she could definitely tell that the men did not believe her. But Françoise didn't really care. At this point, she really just wanted to leave. And so she just turned and gave Sylvie a hug and then just said bye to the group who were just kind of sitting there somewhat stunned this is happening so quickly. And then Françoise turned and she hustled right out of the club and flagged down a cab before any of them could follow her. The next morning, Françoise woke up in her own bed to the sound of her boyfriend, Yves Martin, bustling around her bedroom and getting dressed. She rolled over to look at her alarm clock and saw that it was 8 a.m. Françoise sat up, and Yves turned to her and said good morning, but she immediately noticed that his voice was cold. And she knew why. The night before, when she had come home, they had gotten into a big argument because, he had been waiting for her for quite a while, for hours, by the time she finally got there. That was the reason she had to leave, and it really had upset him. And in many ways, this was not like a one-off issue in their relationship. It was a recurring one. Françoise was always staying out super late with her friends, and often with her male friends, and Yves felt like she was basically prioritizing all of them over him. He worked during the day, so the evenings were really the only time that he and Françoise could reasonably get together, but Françoise never seemed to get home until super late, and at that point it was too late for Yves to come over, or vice versa, and so they just didn't get to see each other as much as they could be. And so now, Françoise knew she had to do something to try to smooth things over with her boyfriend. So she turned to Yves and said, hey, do you want to come over tonight after you get off work? And she promised she would actually be home when he got there so they could cook dinner together and just spend some time together. It would be just a night for them. And at that, Francoise saw Eve's shoulders immediately relax. And then he turned around and he smiled at her and said, "You know what? I'd really, really like that." And so at this point, the mood in the room completely shifted. They were sort of back on good terms. And so as Eve finished getting dressed, he asked Francoise what else she had going on that day. And she told him that she had a handyman she knew named Christian Moreau who was coming by that morning to put up new wallpaper in the apartment. So she'd very likely be stuck at home for most of the day while he worked on it. The two chatted for a bit longer, and then once Eve was ready to leave, Francoise kissed him goodbye, and then after he left, Francoise pulled herself out of bed and put on a robe. And then she went into the kitchen and she opened up a can of food for her cat, and then she made herself some coffee. She was a bit hungover from the night before, and she thought maybe a warm bath would make her feel better. So after she drank her coffee, she ran a bath, she got into the water, and she closed her eyes. At 11 a.m. the next morning, so December 13th, a janitor at the Trousseau Hospital in Tours, France, was carrying a trash bag out to the dumpster when he noticed something odd. There were two blue trash bags just sitting out on a strip of grass in the middle of the hospital's parking lot. Now, the trash bags they used at the hospital were gray, so the janitor knew these blue bags, had to have been left there by someone from outside of the hospital. So the janitor walked over to the bags and sort of inspected them from the outside, and they were sort of bulky, but he couldn't really tell what was inside of them. And then he just reached down and he opened one of them, and when he saw what was inside, he immediately stumbled back, turned, and ran inside, shouting for someone to call the police. About an hour later, so just before noon on December 13th, 1988, Chief Inspector Francois Barbier of the Tours Police Department walked across the parking lot of the Trousseau Hospital. He'd been sent out here to investigate human remains that had been found outside of the hospital, and he was the first officer to arrive on the scene, and so now a janitor was walking with him to show him the way to where the remains had been found. They walked over to a grassy strip in the middle of the parking lot, and they stopped next to a pair of blue trash bags. Inspector Barbier knelt down and he opened up one of the bags, and inside he saw very clearly there were two severed arms and the lower part of two legs. He opened up the other blue bag and he found it contained a woman's torso, but there was no pelvis, no thighs, and no head. Barbier turned to the janitor, who he knew had found the remains, and he asked him, when did you find this? And the janitor said that he had been out doing his rounds, throwing his own trash away around 11 a.m., and that's when he had seen them. But they definitely had not been there when he had done his rounds at 9 a.m. that day. So clearly these had to have been dropped off sometime between 9 and 11. Barbier stood up and looked around, and he noticed there actually was a medical school right down the street. And for a second, he wondered if maybe this was all just a tasteless prank by some of the students who could have maybe stolen a cadaver from the hospital's morgue and dropped it here. But as he thought about it, he just couldn't imagine medical students desecrating a human body like that. I mean, even as a prank, it just seemed not possible. And so to him, it just seemed like the more obvious answer here, albeit a gruesome one, was that this woman contained in these two bags had been murdered, and whoever killed her chopped her body up and put them in these bags because it would be easier to dispose of her body that way. And so Barbier hoped that when the forensics team showed up, they'd be able to find fingerprints from the killer on the blue trash bags. Because at this point, they didn't have a head of this woman. The victim didn't have a head. And so it could be very challenging to identify who it was. And if you didn't know who the victim was, it would be even harder to narrow down who might have killed her. 4 days later, on the afternoon of December 17th, Barbier was reading over an autopsy report at his desk. After the initial discovery of those blue trash bags at the hospital, more body parts from what appeared to be the same body had been found dumped behind a clothing store in a commercial part of town. But the head was still missing. And with no clues as to who the victim was, the investigation really was just barely crawling along. The police had put out a press release about the body's discovery, but so far no one had come forward with information, and there had been no women who had been reported missing in the area recently. Also, no usable fingerprints had been found on the trash bags, and so at this point, they really just didn't have forensic evidence, and so they were not able to even begin to track down who the killer was or what happened to them. And now, as Barbier continued to read through this autopsy report, he saw that the medical examiner had run the victim's fingerprints through the database, but there was no match. And so again, there's just like no leads in this case so far. However, as Barbier continued reading through this report, he saw that the autopsy did reveal that the victim had died recently, probably only one day before her remains were discovered. She appeared to have bled to death from 2 deep gashes on her wrists, and there were also traces of an anti-anxiety medicine that was in her blood, which suggested she might have been drugged before she was killed. And Barbier was sort of baffled by this, because the method of murder almost seemed gentle and controlled, compared to the extreme violence that was done to the body post-mortem. Like, those two things were totally in contrast with each other. And so he wondered if this was all done this way out of necessity. And so maybe the killer was just too small or too weak, or maybe both, to kill the victim without sedating her first. And then also, along those same lines, maybe they couldn't move her body without chopping it up first. And so as Barbier is just sort of thinking through what could have happened here, the phone on his desk rang. He put down the report and he picked up the phone, and it was a woman who said that she had just seen a newspaper article about the dead body, and she thought it could be a woman named Françoise Gendron, who lived in an apartment complex called La Vallée Violette. And so Barbier immediately sat up, he grabbed his pen, and he wrote down the name and the address. But before he could ask who the caller was or why she thought the victim could be this woman Françoise, the caller hung up. BetterHelp is the paid partner of today's video. Are you so used to keeping everyone else comfortable that you barely notice how often you abandon yourself in the process? I think a lot of us have been there. You get so used to putting everyone else first that taking care of yourself almost starts to feel selfish. And after a while, putting other people first stops feeling like a choice. Until one day, you realize you can't remember the last time a decision genuinely felt like your own. And the strange thing about constantly managing other people's comfort is that slowly you lose touch with your own. And this is where therapy can help you understand where those patterns come from. And it can help you rebuild trust in your own voice, your own instincts, and the parts of yourself that get pushed aside just to keep everybody else comfortable. BetterHelp makes starting therapy easier. Take the quiz and get matched with a credentialed therapist quickly. BetterHelp has served over 6 million people globally. Click the link in the description or go to betterhelp.com/MrBallin and get 10% off your first month of therapy. Half an hour later, Barbier walked through the hallway on the first floor of the La Vallée Violette apartment complex, where his mystery caller had told him his victim lived. This was the first lead he had gotten since the body was found, so he was hopeful that something would come of it. Now, the woman who called didn't actually give the apartment number for Françoise, just that she lived in this complex. And so Barbier just literally walked down the hallway and knocked on an apartment door at random. And the man who answered, Barbier asked him if he knew a woman named Françoise Gendron and did she live here? And the man just nodded and said, yep, she lives here. And then he pointed to a door right down the same hallway. And then the man, unprompted, told Barbier that he hadn't seen anybody go in or out of that apartment for at least a few days, and he was starting to get worried about Françoise's cat. Barbier's heart began to race, because if Françoise really did live in that apartment, and she really hadn't been around in days, well, it seemed very possible that she was his victim. So he thanked the man and said he would handle it, and then he walked down the hallway to the door, and he knocked. And there was no answer. But he could hear a cat meowing inside. And so at this point, Barbier was feeling really confident about the anonymous tip. And so he just turned and hurried back out to his car, and he radioed for a forensics team to come to this apartment complex. And then a few minutes later, they arrived carrying a battering ram to break down the door. And so Barbier and the team, they go back down the hallway to Françoise's door. Barbier got out of the way, and then the officers smashed it down with this ram. And then once it was open, Barbier stepped inside the apartment. As soon as Barbier was in this apartment, he was standing in the living room, and he looked around and nothing seemed disturbed. However, when he left the living room and went into the kitchen, it was a different story. Now, the kitchen was not a total disaster, but there was a broken dish on the ground and some food items that must have been on the dish at some point that also were scattered across the floor. And so just at first glance, it appeared like maybe some sort of struggle happened in here. However, Barbier looked around the kitchen and he didn't find any blood anywhere, so it was just this broken plate. And then when Barbier checked the rest of the apartment, No drawers or closets looked like they'd been ransacked, so this didn't appear like an apartment that had been robbed at any point. However, one thing Barbier did notice was in the bedroom, there were a few unopened rolls of wallpaper on a stool, like as if somebody had been about to do some work in the bedroom, but then just didn't. Barbier told the forensics team to first make sure the cat got fed, because there was a cat in here, and the cat was, a little malnourished, but basically okay. And then to sweep the apartment for fingerprints to see whether Francoise's prints matched the victim. And if she was the victim, he was hoping they might also find fingerprints or blood inside the apartment from whoever might have killed her. And so the forensics team, they got to work, and Barbier, he just continued sort of walking around the apartment, looking at photos that were out on display, to maybe get a sense of Francoise's body size, to sort of mentally compare it to the victim's body. And as he was doing this, he happened to glance out the window and he saw a young man standing on the sidewalk outside who clearly was watching the police through the glass. And when Barbier locked eyes with this guy, the guy suddenly looked terrified and he just turned and began speed walking away, at which point Barbier opened up the window and shouted at this guy to stay right where he was. An hour later, Inspector Barbier walked into an interview room at the Tours police station and sat down across from the young man who had been watching Francoise's apartment. By now, he knew this man's name was Yves Martin, and he claimed to have been Francoise's boyfriend. And so Barbier sits down and he asks Yves, what were you doing outside of Francoise's apartment when I saw you? And Yves said that he had just come by the apartment to see if Francoise was home, but he got there and saw police inside and he knew something was wrong. But he specified that he hadn't seen or heard from her in about 5 days and didn't know she was missing, the last time he spoke to her was the morning of December 12th. Now, the instant Yves said December 12th, Barbier thought of two things. One is that was actually the day before the body was found in the parking lot, and two, based on the autopsy report, it was presumed that the victim was killed the day before her body was found, so December 12th. And so it's pretty suspicious that this guy is mentioning December 12th as the last time he saw Francoise. And so Barbier leaned in and he asked Yves to elaborate about the last time he saw Francoise on the 12th. And Yves said he had seen Francoise at her own apartment when he left the apartment around 8 a.m. on the 12th, and the two of them had made plans to meet up again at her place that evening. But he said when he got there that night, she wasn't home. But this was not unusual for her. So Yves explained that he just let himself inside her apartment with the spare key she had given him, and he just made himself dinner and he watched TV while he waited for her to eventually show up. And then he said at around 8 p.m., her landline, her home landline phone began to ring. Yves said that he answered the phone, which was not totally unusual, and he said the person who was calling claimed to be one of Francoise's friends. Yves said he didn't recognize the voice, but he said Francoise had a big circle of friends and he for sure did not know all of them. But Yves told Barbier that this caller was not calling the apartment to try to reach Francoise. They were calling the apartment to reach him, Yves, to tell him that apparently Francoise had decided to go out of town this weekend with some other friends and that she would not be home tonight. And Yves said this was not the first time that Francoise had ditched him. And so in his frustration after being told this by this friend, he said he grabbed his dinner plate and just chucked it on the floor and shattered it, and then he left. Barbier was surprised to hear this, and he was thinking if Yves was the type of person who would immediately start breaking things over something that, didn't seem like that big of a deal, well, what else was he capable of? However, as potentially suspicious as Yves was, Barbier had not actually confirmed whether Francoise was even his victim. This could just be a coincidence here, that she left town right before this body was found. She could be just fine. And so before Barbier let Yves go, because he couldn't really hold him at this point, he asked Yves to just give him a detailed account of what else he had done on December 12th. He wanted to get the full timeline of what he did on that day. And Yves just said after he had left Francoise's apartment that morning, when he and Francoise had made plans to meet up that night, he said he had spent most of the day at work, and then he had gone back to Francoise's apartment after work, and then after he had waited around for a while and got that phone call and broke the plate, he said he had just left and gone straight to his own apartment, which he shared with his mother, and he was there all night. And so Barbier wrote down what he said and made a note to follow up on his alibi. And then before he let Yves go, he just asked him if Francoise was planning to go anywhere or meet anybody on the day he last saw her. And Yves, he thought about it for a moment, And then he said, yeah, actually there was one thing Francoise had mentioned to him. She had told him that an acquaintance named Christian Moreau was supposed to come over her apartment later that morning to put up some new wallpaper in her apartment. The next morning, December 18th, Inspector Barbier knocked on the door of Christian's apartment, the guy who was going to put up the wallpaper. Now, at this point, forensics still had not confirmed whether or not Francoise was the victim. But for the time being, Barbier was working under the assumption that she was. A few seconds later, a young man answered the door and confirmed he was Christian Moreau. And so Barbier asked him if he remembered going to Francoise Gendron's apartment on December 12th. And Christian said yes, he did remember, but he seemed confused about why he was being asked about it by a police officer. Barbier explained that Francoise was presumed to be missing and had even been possibly killed on the same day that Christian was at her apartment. And Christian looked very surprised to hear this. And he just said, I was there on the 12th. I got there around 10 a.m. that morning. Francoise seemed perfectly fine. She appeared to have just gotten out of the bath, and it just didn't seem like anything was wrong. However, Christian said he was only in the apartment around Francoise for like a minute because he just dropped off the new wallpaper and was going to install it on another day. So it was a very brief interaction, but again, she seemed fine during this very brief interaction. Barbier obviously had seen those rolls of new wallpaper just sitting in Francoise's apartment, so he figured this part of Christian's story had to be true, that he must have dropped them off. But it did seem a bit odd to drop the wallpaper off on one day and then come back at another time to actually perform the work. Like you could easily just do those two things at the same time. So he wondered whether this had actually been the plan all along, or if something unexpected had happened inside of the apartment with Francoise that had somehow stopped Christian from installing the wallpaper on that first visit. So Barbier asked Christian for his alibi for the rest of the day that Francoise had last been seen, which was the 12th. And Christian went over his entire day, he provided all the information, and then afterwards, Barbier, after taking down some notes, he said he would be in touch. Now at this moment, Barbier didn't have enough evidence to hold Christian for more questioning. But as he walked back to his car, Barbier hoped that forensics might find some fingerprints or blood in Francoise's apartment that could implicate Christian. A day later, Barbier sat down at his desk and read over a forensics report on Francoise's apartment. Now, there hadn't been any blood traces found, but a set of fingerprints had been pulled from the phone, and they matched the hands that had been found inside the blue trash bag. So this confirmed that Francoise was indeed the victim. But so far, there was no evidence pointing to who killed her. Yves, Francoise's boyfriend, his alibi checked out. And that handyman, Christian Moreau, he also had a solid alibi. And then as for Francoise's 19-year-old son, who was serving in the military, well, he was confirmed to have been at his barracks over 200 miles away at the time of the murder, and so he was ruled out as a suspect. And then also he would say that he had not heard from his mother since several days before she was actually killed. Barbier was still trying to figure out who was that person who called Francoise's apartment when Yves was there, to tell Yves that, hey, your girlfriend's going to be out of town this weekend, because it just seemed like that was pretty suspicious, and this person who was calling must know something about Francoise's death. But this was the 1980s, so it was harder to get a hold of phone logs than it is today. Now, Barbier had submitted an order for those phone logs, but the order had to be signed by a judge still, and then it could also take several more days beyond that to actually get the records, and so there was a bit of a wait. However, just then, another officer knocked on Barbier's door and said that a phone call had just come in from someone claiming to have information about Francoise Gendron. And so Barbier, he picks up the phone and he hears a woman's voice, and this woman tells him that she has information on Francoise. And Barbier immediately wondered, is this the same anonymous woman who called in before with that tip that Francoise was the victim? But Barbier just couldn't quite tell if it was the same voice. And so this woman told Barbier that she had been a very close friend of Francoise's, and she knew about two men named Michel and Luc who might have been involved in Francoise's death. She said right before she died, Francoise had found out that these two men were secretly involved in drug trafficking, and apparently they had talked about killing Francoise if she reported them to the police. Specifically, the caller said these two men had threatened Francoise that they would drug her, bleed her out, chop her into pieces, and then cut off her head so she could never be identified. Early the next morning, so on December 20th, 1988, 7 days after Francoise's body was found, Chief Inspector Barbier pulled up outside of a discount store in a shopping area in Tours. In front of the store, there were two men unloading boxes from a semi-truck. Barbier, he got out of his car and he began walking towards them. And when these two men saw the detective approaching, they immediately seemed sort of panicked. And when Barbier got close enough, he asked them if they were the store's owners, Michel and Luc, and one of the men nodded. At which point Barbier said, "You two are coming with me." About an hour later, Barbier walked down the hallway at the police station, past the doors of the interrogation rooms where Michel and Luc were currently being held. But first, he wanted to speak to the third person the police had brought in for questioning that morning, Sylvie Reverigo, who happened to be Francoise's best friend and friends with Michel and Luc. And he sat down across from her and he basically said, "Look, we know you're connected to the two men, Michel and Luc, and also to Francoise, and we want to know if you know anything about these two guys, because apparently they could have been threatening Francoise. We think they could be involved. Tell me everything you know." And Sylvie would tell Barbier that she was actually scared of Michel and Luc, and that was why she had not come to police yet, because she was worried if she told them what she knew, they would hurt her. She told Barbier that those two men had told her, Sylvie, that they intended to kill Francoise because they were worried that Francoise was going to report them to police for drug trafficking and selling stolen cars. And Sylvie said she didn't know if they were actually capable of that, but she just was too worried about going to the police about it and feared they would find out and then she would become a target as well. And so he and Sylvie chatted for a bit longer, and he got some additional information about when exactly they spoke to her and said this, and some other details about sort of their demeanor and the people they hung out with. And then after that, Barbier got up, he left the interrogation room, and in the hallway, he caught up with the detective who had actually already begun interrogating Luc. And the detective said that so far, Luc had totally refused to cooperate, and he'd outright denied even knowing who Sylvie was. Barbier sighed when he heard this, and he had a feeling right away that Michel was not going to be any more cooperative. But he was going to try his best to crack him. So Barbier went into the room where Michel was being held, and after he sat down, he just asked Michel if he had seen the news about that woman who was found chopped up in trash bags in a hospital parking lot. And Michel said yes, he had heard about that. And then he made a joke that maybe a surgeon at the hospital had made a pretty bad mistake or something. Barbier didn't react to the joke, and instead he just pulled out a folder and slid it across the table. And then Michel, he opened it up, and what he saw were photos of those blue trash bags and also photos of the severed body parts that had been found inside of them. And when Michel saw these pictures, he went completely pale. Barbier then asked Michel, "Do you know who that body belonged to?" And Michel, he just looked up and shook his head and said no. Barbier just stared at Michel for a moment, sort of just gauging his reaction. And then eventually he said, "Well, the body belonged to Francoise Gendron." When Michel heard this, he really looked like he was in complete shock. But Barbier immediately followed up and said, "Michel, did you kill Francoise?" And Michel, his reaction was to immediately shout no, that Francoise was a great friend of his and he would never hurt her. Barbier was crazy for thinking he would do that. And then again and again, he just insisted that he was completely innocent here. Now, immediately, Barbier thought Michel's reaction here was pretty genuine. But just then, there was a knock on the door, and so Barbier, he got up and he stepped out into the hallway, and another officer told him that the forensics team had just found a piece of evidence that almost certainly would crack this case wide open. Based on forensic evidence and an eventual confession, this is what police believe happened to Francoise Gendron on the morning of December 12, 1988. Around 10 a.m., the killer knocked on the door of Francoise's apartment. Francoise answered the door wrapped in a towel and told the killer to come on inside. The killer stepped in and they acted very friendly and casual, as if this visit was nothing out of the ordinary. But after the two had chatted for a while, the killer decided it was time to put their plan into action. After all, Francoise was a problem for them, and they had to deal with her once and for all. So, at some point, the killer told Francoise that they had something they wanted to show her, and asked if she would come over to the killer's home just for a minute to show them. Francoise eventually agreed, and once she got dressed, the two of them headed out together. And so the two of them, they walk their way to the killer's home, they go inside, and then before the killer is going to show Francoise, what they brought them over here to show them, they first made them both a pot of tea. And critically, the killer crushed up a few anti-anxiety pills and put those in the bottom of Francoise's cup of tea. Then the killer brought the tea over to the kitchen table where Francoise was sitting, and the killer sat down with her, and they both drank their tea. The killer made sure Francoise drank her entire cup, but by the time Francoise had finished her tea, she was so sedated from the drugs that she could barely sit up. At this point, the killer knew they could move on to the next phase of their plan. And so the killer at this point lifted Francoise up out of the seat. She didn't put up a fight, and they carried her over to the bathroom, and they put her into the tub, and they turned on the water. And then eventually, when the water filled up high enough, the killer just pushed Francoise's head under the water, and again, Francoise, because of the drugs, couldn't do anything to stop it. And she remained under the water until she fell unconscious. After Francoise was dead, the killer simply drained the tub and then cut Francoise's body into pieces to make it easier to dispose of. They took the pieces and shoved them into blue trash bags and then dumped them in the parking lot of a nearby hospital 10 minutes away. But the bigger problem for the killer was Francoise's head. The killer wanted to completely erase Francoise's identity. So, for that reason, they kept her head at their home. They would flush Francoise's teeth down the toilet, and they would take the other pieces of her head and they would throw them into a nearby river. However, despite all this effort, the killer forgot one thing, which was they put Francoise's hands in those blue trash bags, and so her body was identified by her fingerprints just a few days later. And then not long after that, a tip soon led the police right to the killer's door, and when they investigated the killer's home, they found crucial pieces of evidence in her bathroom. The killer was Francoise's own best friend, Sylvie Reverigo. Sylvie had always been sort of jealous of Francoise, primarily because she seemed happy all the time. And on top of that, Francoise got a lot of attention from men, which just, again, made Sylvie jealous. And since the two women, post-divorce, were spending so much time together, even more than in their childhood, their friendship had gotten suffocatingly close. And over this recent period of time where they were sort of on top of each other, Sylvie's jealousy and sort of resentment towards Francoise turned into full-blown hatred. Initially, Sylvie had tried to pin the murder on Michel and Luc by telling another friend of Francoise's, a woman named Yvette, that those two men had threatened to kill Francoise. And just as Sylvie had hoped, Yvette had called the police and passed along what she had said. But unbeknownst to Sylvie, Yvette also shared another tip with the investigators, which was that a few days after the murder, Yvette's own daughter had happened to go to Sylvie's house, and her daughter had found 2 gold dental crowns in the toilet. And the daughter and Yvette both knew that Francoise had gold dental crowns. So, by the time Sylvie was brought in for questioning, Inspector Barbier was already pretty sure she must have had something to do with Francoise's death. And so police would search Sylvie's home, and they would find traces of blood, and they would also find some of Francoise's jewelry hidden inside of a box. And then when Sylvie was confronted with all this evidence and testimony during her interrogation, Sylvie broke down and confessed. Sylvie Reverigo was charged with Francoise's murder on December 21st, 1988. 3 years later, she was convicted and sentenced to life in prison.
It is 5:30 in the morning on March 24th,
Thank you so much for watching.
1998.
Let me know what you thought of
Ron
today's
wakes
episode
up in
in
his
the
cabin
comments.
and he gently pushes
Remember,
the heavy
we have a
sliding
whole
glass door
playlist of
open
true
to the
crime
private
episodes
balcony.
ready for
The
you to
ocean air
binge
is
right
cold,
now.
but when he looks
So
to his
click
right,
here
he sees
and
his
give them a watch.
23-year-old daughter
All right.
Amy curled up on the lounge chair, sleeping peacefully. So he quietly slides the door shut so he does not wake her, and he goes back to bed. 30 minutes later at 6 o'clock, Ron wakes up again. He looks through the glass, but the lounge chair is empty. He slides the door open and steps out onto the balcony, expecting Amy to be leaning against the railing, looking at the water. But she is not there. He looks down at the deck. Her sandals are sitting neatly side by side next to the chair. And that is when Ron's stomach completely drops. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do. And we upload multiple times a week, So if that's of interest to you, please invite the like button over for a fancy dinner, and then when the bill comes, excuse yourself to use the restroom and climb out the bathroom window. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications. Okay, let's get into today's story. In the spring of 1998, 23-year-old Amy Lynn Bradley was living a very quiet and structured life in Petersburg, Virginia. And she was someone who was known for being incredibly athletic and deeply attached to her family. She had recently graduated from Longwood University with a degree in physical education, and she spent a lot of her time playing basketball and working as a trained lifeguard. But despite spending so much time around pools and having incredible swimming skills, Amy had a very specific fear. She was deeply afraid of the open ocean. She did not like the idea of dark, deep water where you could not see the bottom. And so, when her parents, Ron and Iva, announced that they had been gifted a week-long luxury Caribbean cruise and wanted the whole family to go, Amy was immediately hesitant. She told her parents that she really did not want to go out on the open water. But Ron and Iva really wanted this to be a family bonding experience. Her younger brother Brad was also going, and they assured Amy that she would be perfectly safe. They told her that modern cruise ships are basically massive floating cities, and she would not even feel like she was on the water most of the time. And eventually, she agreed to go. So on March 21st, the Bradley family boarded the Rhapsody of the Seas, which was a massive, state-of-the-art Royal Caribbean cruise ship. And just as her parents had promised, the ship was absolutely huge. It had 10 decks, sweeping glass elevators, multiple dining rooms, swimming pools, and thousands of passengers and crew members on board. The family was given a very nice suite on Deck 8, which featured a private balcony that looked right out over the water. And for the first couple of days, everything went perfectly. Amy started to relax. She spent time by the pool with her brother, she had formal dinners with her parents, and the fear she had about the ocean seemed to completely fade away. Now on the evening of Monday, March 23rd, the ship was sailing through the Caribbean Sea, making its way toward its next port of call in Curaçao. And the family had dinner together, and then they all decided to go their separate ways for the night. Ron and Iva went back to the suite on Deck 8 to get some sleep, while Amy and Brad decided to head up to the top deck where there was a massive dance party going on. There was a live calypso band playing, the bars were open, and the deck was packed with people dancing and having a good time. And Amy and Brad were right in the middle of it. They were taking photos, talking to other passengers, and just enjoying the vacation. But during the party, Brad noticed something a little off. There was a waiter working the deck party that night, a crew member who went by the nickname Yellow. And Yellow was paying a very unusual amount of attention to Amy. He kept approaching her, trying to dance with her. And at one point, he even pulled Brad aside and asked him exactly where they were going to be going later that night. Brad essentially brushed the guy off, thinking he was just a persistent bartender trying to flirt, and he did not think much of it at the time. By about 3:30 in the morning, the party was winding down, and the deck was mostly empty. So Amy and Brad decided to call it a night. They walked to the glass elevators, rode them down to Deck 8, and walked down the long, quiet, carpeted hallway to their suite. And the ship's electronic lock system would later prove that their cabin door was opened at exactly 3:40 in the morning. When they got inside, Ron and Iva were already fast asleep. Brad went straight to his bed and went to sleep, and Amy stayed up for a little bit. And that brings us back to the early morning hours. At 5:15 in the morning, Ron wakes up. He gets out of bed, and he looks over toward the glass door leading out to the balcony. And through the glass, he can clearly see Amy. She is curled up on the lounge chair wearing a dark shirt and shorts, and she is sleeping quietly. Ron watches her for a moment, and then he just goes back to bed. 45 minutes go by. It is exactly 6 o'clock in the morning. Ron wakes up again, and he decides to get up for the day. He looks over at the balcony door, but this time, the lounge chair is completely empty. So he walks over, he slides the heavy glass door open, and he steps out into the cold morning air. He looks left, he looks right. He expects to see Amy leaning over the railing, maybe watching the sun come up, but she is just gone. And right next to the lounge chair, sitting perfectly flat on the wooden deck, are her sandals. Ron immediately turns around and walks back into the cabin. He looks at Brad's bed, but Brad is asleep. He looks in the bathroom, but it is empty. So he wakes up Iva and he says he cannot find Amy. Iva gets up and they start looking around the small cabin to see if she left a note. But there is no note. But as Ron is checking the desk where Amy kept her personal items, he notices something. Her room key is still there, and her identification is still there. But her pack of cigarettes and her lighter are missing. At this point, Ron and Iva wake up. Brad and the three of them step out into the hallway. The ship is completely silent. Most of the passengers are still asleep. They split up and start walking the decks. They check the pool area, the dining halls, the lounges. They ask the few crew members they see if anyone has seen a young woman with short brown hair, but no one has. After about 30 minutes of frantic searching, Ron runs down to the purser's desk in the main lobby. He slams his hands on the counter and tells the staff that his daughter is missing. He says they need to make a ship-wide announcement over the intercom system right now to see if anyone knows where she is. But the crew member behind the desk just looks at him and shakes his head. The crew member explains that it is far too early in the morning and they absolutely will not use the public address system because they do not want to wake up the other passengers and cause a panic. Ron is standing there arguing with the staff, begging them to do something. And right at that exact moment, Ron hears a massive mechanical clank echoing through the ship. He turns around and looks out the lobby windows. The ship has just docked in Curaçao, and the main doors on the lower deck are opening. The gangway is being lowered right onto the concrete pier. Ron turns back to the crew and yells at them to lock the doors. He says, "You cannot let anyone off this ship until we find her." But the crew refuses. And slowly, hundreds of passengers and crew members begin pouring off the massive ship, flooding out into the busy port city of Curaçao, blending into the crowds, getting into taxis, and walking away. It took hours before the ship's administration finally took the situation seriously. By the time they initiated a formal search, the ship was practically empty. The crew and eventually local authorities searched all 1,000 cabins. They checked the maintenance rooms, the cargo holds, and the staff quarters. The Coast Guard was called in to run search patterns in the open water along the ship's route, looking for any sign that someone had gone overboard. But they found absolutely nothing. There was no body in the water. There was no sign of a struggle on the balcony. There was no blood. And as the investigators sat down with Ron and Iva, the reality of those missing items from the desk finally hit them. If Amy had accidentally leaned too far over the railing and fallen into the ocean, her cigarettes and her lighter would still be in the room, but they were gone. That meant Amy had intentionally taken them. She had woken up on the balcony sometime between 5:15 and 6 o'clock, realized she wanted a cigarette, and decided to leave the room. Because you were not allowed to smoke on the private balconies, she would have had to walk out into the public areas of the ship to find a designated smoking area. She left her shoes behind because she was just going to step out for a few minutes. She walked out into the empty, quiet corridors of that massive ship alone. And out there in that 30-minute window of time, she crossed paths with someone. Someone who managed to completely subdue a highly trained, athletic young woman without making a single sound, hide her somewhere on a ship filled with thousands of people, and then smuggle her off the vessel the moment the doors opened in Curaçao. The authorities were dealing with an impossible timeline. A person had been abducted from a closed, floating environment in just 30 minutes, and the people responsible had simply vanished. The ship eventually had to leave port, and the Bradley family refused to get back on it. They stayed in Curaçao dealing with the American embassy, putting up missing person flyers all over the island and doing numerous television interviews begging for information. And for months there was nothing but silence. But then the sightings began. In August of 1998, about 5 months after Amy vanished, a Canadian computer engineer was walking down a crowded public beach in Curaçao. And as he was walking, he noticed a young woman walking toward him. She was being flanked by 2 very rough-looking men who were gripping her arms tightly. The engineer stared at the woman because she looked terrified, but what really caught his attention were her tattoos. He clearly saw a Tasmanian devil spinning a basketball tattooed on her shoulder, a gecko tattooed on her navel, and a complex tribal design on her lower back. The engineer did not know who Amy Bradley was at the time, so he just kept walking. But months later, when he saw a television special featuring those exact highly specific tattoos, he immediately contacted the authorities. By the time investigators went to that beach, the trail was completely cold. A year later, in 1999, a sailor in the United States Navy was on shore leave in Curaçao. He walked into a local brothel late at night. The music was loud and the room was very dark. And as he was standing near the bar, a young woman with short brown hair suddenly walked right up to him. She grabbed his arm, looked him dead in the eyes, and whispered, "My name is Amy Bradley. Please help me." But before the sailor could even process what she had just said, 2 large men stepped out of the shadows, grabbed the woman by the shoulders, and aggressively dragged her upstairs. The sailor was terrified. And because visiting the brothel was a direct violation of military rules, he was afraid to report what he saw. It was not until much later when he finally saw a missing person poster that he called the family. But once again, when investigators raided the building, there was no sign of her. Then in 2005, a woman was washing her hands in a public restroom inside a large department store in Barbados. One of the bathroom stall doors opened, and a woman walked out. She was accompanied by 3 men who were crowding her, practically pushing her toward the exit. The witness later told police that the woman looked completely hollowed out, exhausted, and terrified. She matched Amy's description perfectly. But by the time security was alerted, the group had completely disappeared into the crowded streets. And shortly after that restroom sighting, an anonymous email was sent to the Bradley family. Attached to the email was a photograph that had been found on an adult website operating out of the Caribbean. The photo showed a woman sitting on the edge of a bed in a dimly lit room wearing only her underwear. She was looking down at the floor, and her face was heavily contoured with exhaustion. The website listed her working name as Jas, but when forensic experts analyzed the photo, they found that the facial structure, the jawline, the exact shape of the eyes, and even a very specific freckle located just under the right eye were an identical match to Amy Lynn Bradley. The authorities tried to track the IP address of the website, but it was routed through multiple untraceable servers, and the physical location of the room in the photograph could never be found. Amy Lynn Bradley vanished on the morning of March 24, 1998. The FBI maintains an open, active file on her case, and there is a massive financial reward for any information leading to her recovery. But despite all of the sightings, all of the witnesses, and the photographic evidence that she survived that morning on the ship, her actual location remains completely unknown. And to this day, they do not have an explanation for how someone was snatched from a closed ship in exactly 30 minutes without leaving a single physical trace behind. Now, a ship in the middle of the ocean is the perfect isolated trap, because there is simply nowhere to run. But sometimes, a trap does not need to be surrounded by water. Sometimes it is hidden right in the middle of a massive, bustling city, just waiting behind a wall of green trees. On a humid Tuesday afternoon in early 1998, 21-year-old Selma was standing on a crowded sidewalk in the Pinheiros district of Sao Paulo, Brazil. And the streets around her were completely jammed with cars and delivery trucks, the air thick with the smell of exhaust fumes and hot asphalt. So she was waiting for a break in the traffic to cross the wide avenue to get to her second job. Selma worked behind the counter at a local bakery starting at 4 o'clock in the morning, and then she spent her afternoons handing out promotional flyers for a nearby dental clinic. And she hated handing out flyers. She had always wanted to be a fashion model, and she spent a large portion of her incredibly small income buying glossy fashion magazines and practicing her posture in the small, cracked mirror in her shared apartment. But the modeling agencies in the massive city were extremely competitive, and they required expensive professional portfolios just to get an interview. Selma did not have the money to pay for a professional photographer, so she just kept waking up early, working her 2 jobs, and hoping she would eventually save enough money to get real photos taken so she could finally start her career. And as she was standing on the corner with a thick stack of glossy paper in her hand, a young man pulled up to the curb on a small red motorcycle. He turned the engine off, kicked the heavy metal stand down, and took off his helmet. He had dark curly hair, a slight overbite, and a very friendly, disarming smile. He was wearing a dark windbreaker jacket and standard blue jeans. And he just stood there next to his bike, watching her for a moment. So Selma ignored him, at first, looking down at the stack of papers in her hand and shifting her weight because her feet were tired. But then he walked right up to her. He politely apologized for interrupting her work, and he reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a crisp white business card and handed it to her. Selma looked down at the card resting in her palm. It was printed on heavy, expensive cardstock. It had a sleek, minimalist logo in the top corner, and it listed him as an independent talent scout for several of the major, highly reputable modeling agencies located in the wealthy center of the city. And she looked back up at him. He told her that he had been riding past on his way to an appointment, but he had to stop because she had the exact bone structure and height that his corporate clients were currently looking for. He asked if she had any professional representation or a manager, and Selma shook her head. He smiled again, a very warm professional smile. He said that was actually perfect, and he offered to do a free test shoot with her that exact afternoon. He told her he had a high-end camera in the hard plastic storage box on the back of his motorcycle, and they could just go to the local park take a few simple headshots in the natural light, and he would personally submit them to his boss by the end of the workday. Now, Selma was a smart young woman who had grown up in a massive, chaotic city. She knew better than to just get on the back of a motorcycle with a complete stranger. But she looked down at the business card again. It felt incredibly legitimate in her hand. And the man was completely polite. He was not crowding her physical space, he was not speaking aggressively, and he was offering her the exact opportunity she had been dreaming about for years completely for free. And she reasoned that they were just going to a public park in the middle of the afternoon. It would be full of families having picnics and people jogging on the paved paths. There was no real danger in taking a few photos in the bright sunlight, so she nodded. She slipped the thick business card into her front pocket, threw the remaining dental clinic flyers into a nearby public trash can, and put on the spare helmet he offered her. She climbed onto the back of the motorcycle, holding on to the metal grips behind the seat, and he pulled out into the heavy city traffic. And they rode south through the winding, congested streets for about 45 minutes. The tall glass and concrete buildings of the city eventually began to thin out, giving way to a massive, towering wall of green trees. This was the state park, known locally as Parque do Estado. And it was not a typical manicured city park with swing sets and open grassy fields. It was essentially a sprawling 3 million square meter remnant of the ancient Atlantic forest, sitting right on the edge of the urban grid. It was incredibly dense, filled with towering canopy trees, massive ferns, and thick, tangled underbrush. So the man turned the motorcycle off the main paved road and onto a narrow dirt path that cut deep into the trees. And he rode for several minutes until the loud sounds of the city traffic completely faded away, replaced by the heavy, isolated sound of insects and birds. He finally stopped the bike in a small, shadowed clearing surrounded by thick bushes. Selma took off the helmet and handed it back to him. He opened the storage box on the back of the bike, but he did not pull out a camera. He pulled out a length of thick nylon cord, and before Selma could even take a step back or ask what it was for, he lunged at her. He slammed his body weight into her, knocking her backward into the dirt, and she fought back immediately. She kicked him hard in the chest, and she scrambled backward into the dead leaves, desperately trying to get back to the dirt path. But he was incredibly fast, and much stronger than he looked. He grabbed her by the hair, dragged her violently deeper into the thick vegetation where the afternoon sunlight could not reach, and he strangled her. And the man who did this was named Francisco de Assis Pereira. He was a 21-year-old motorcycle courier who spent his days delivering legal documents and small corporate packages to office buildings all over Sao Paulo. And to his family, his friends, and his coworkers at the courier dispatch office, he was just a quiet, polite young man who worked hard, followed the rules, and kept completely to himself. But underneath that completely average, mundane exterior, Francisco had spent months developing a highly efficient, systematic method for hunting human beings. He had realized that the massive city was filled with young, ambitious women working menial jobs and desperately trying to escape poverty. And he knew that the promise of a lucrative modeling career was the ultimate bait. So Francisco went to a local print shop and paid to print hundreds of those fake, high-quality business cards. And he kept his red motorcycle spotlessly clean so he would look like a successful professional. He would finish his assigned delivery route early in the afternoon, and then he would just cruise slowly through the busiest commercial districts of the city. He would carefully look for young women waiting at bus stops, handing out flyers, or walking home from school. And he would approach them in broad daylight, surrounded by hundreds of witnesses and moving traffic. He used his courier charm, his soft voice, and the heavy cardstock of his fake credentials to completely disarm them. And because his method was so incredibly public and so seemingly professional, it worked with devastating frequency. Now, a few weeks after Selma disappeared, a group of local hikers walking far off the designated trails in the state park noticed a terrible, heavy smell coming from a cluster of thick bushes deep in the woods. They pushed the dense branches aside and found human remains resting in the damp dirt. So they ran frantically back to the main paved road and flagged down a passing police car. The local detectives arrived and strung up yellow tape around the massive trees. And the scene was completely chaotic. The thick canopy of the trees made the area very dark even in the middle of the day, and the ground was covered in decades of rotting leaves and mud. The forensic team carefully cataloged the position of the body. They noted the defensive wounds on her hands, and they determined that she had been strangled. And as one of the crime scene technicians was shifting the dirt on the ground just a few feet away from the victim, he found a small, white square of paper half buried in the mud. It was stained with dirt and moisture, but the printed black ink was still completely legible. It was a business card for a talent scout. And that specific piece of heavy cardstock was the exact bait that had drawn the victim away from the absolute safety of the crowded city streets and into the total isolation of the deep woods. But the police did not yet understand the massive scale of what they were dealing with. Over the next 6 months, Francisco rapidly accelerated his hunting. He was taking women into the park almost every single week. And the sheer physical size of Parque do Estado worked completely in his favor. It was so massive and so wildly overgrown that he could leave victims just 50 yards from a dirt road, and they would not be found by anyone for months. The families of the missing women were frantically putting up missing person posters on telephone poles and brick walls all over Sao Paulo, completely unaware that their daughters, sisters, and friends were all lying in the exact same forest, just a few miles away. And Francisco would literally ride his motorcycle past those missing person posters on his daily delivery routes, looking at the faces of the women, knowing exactly where they were hidden. He was completely brazen. He would approach a young woman named Patricia outside a shopping mall, hand her the card, and ride her into the park. A week later, he would approach another woman at a busy intersection, smile his warm smile, and take her to the exact same area of the woods. He turned a massive public nature reserve right in the middle of one of the largest cities in the world into his own private hunting ground. And no one realized that the polite courier riding his bike through the traffic was the reason the young women of Sao Paulo were vanishing without a trace. But his absolute confidence eventually led to a mistake. In July of 1998, Francisco approached a 20-year-old woman named Isabella near a busy commercial plaza. He used the exact same routine he had perfected over the last year. The friendly smile, the fake business card, the promise of a lucrative test shoot for a major clothing brand. Isabella agreed. She put on the helmet, and she got on the back of his red motorcycle. He drove her through the traffic, deep into the state park, parked the bike in a small clearing, and told her to walk toward a patch of bright sunlight, filtering down through the heavy tree canopy so he could check the lighting. But as she was walking forward into the brush, Isabella heard the sharp crunch of dry leaves right behind her. She spun around and Francisco was standing right there, his professional smile completely gone, holding a thick piece of cord in his hands. He lunged forward and grabbed her throat. They fell heavily to the ground, rolling violently through the dirt, the dead leaves, and the ferns. Francisco quickly pinned her down with his knees and wrapped his hands tightly around her neck, cutting off her air. "You have to let me go," Isabella choked out, clawing desperately at his face and his arms. "No, I am not leaving you," Francisco said, his voice completely flat, pressing his entire body weight fully onto her chest. But as the edges of her vision started to go dark, Isabella managed to pull her leg up and jam her knee incredibly hard into his stomach. Francisco gasped, his eyes went wide, and he loosened his grip on her throat for just a fraction of a second, and that was all she needed. Isabella scrambled out from under his weight, got to her feet, and sprinted blindly into the dense trees. She did not look back to see if he was behind her. She just ran through the heavy thorn bushes and the thick undergrowth, listening to the heavy crashing footsteps of Francisco chasing her through the wood. She ran for nearly 10 minutes, her clothes tearing on the branches, until she finally burst out of the tree line and onto a paved road on the edge of the park. A passing car saw her covered in dirt and slammed on its brakes. Isabella threw herself against the passenger door, screaming for help, and the driver pulled her inside and sped away. Francisco stopped at the edge of the trees, watched the car disappear down the road, and then calmly walked back into the forest to get his motorcycle and go home. Isabella was taken straight to the police station. She sat in a small room with a sketch artist and gave a highly detailed, incredibly accurate description of the man who had attacked her. She described his dark, curly hair, his slight overbite, the dark jacket he was wearing, and the specific model of his red motorcycle. She also told the detectives exactly how he had lured her, explaining the fake talent scout business card. The police realized this matched the card found near the remains in the woods months earlier. They immediately released the composite sketch to the local news stations, and it was broadcast across the entire country that very night. And less than 24 hours later, the manager of a local courier company was sitting in his living room watching the evening news. He saw the sketch flash on the screen, he heard the specific description of the red motorcycle, and he immediately picked up his phone. He called the police hotline and told the dispatchers that the man in the drawing looked exactly like one of his most reliable delivery drivers, a young man named Francisco de Assis Pereira. The police tracked Francisco to a small rural town near the border of Argentina, where he had fled on his motorcycle after seeing his own face on the television news. They surrounded his location and arrested him without incident. And during his formal interrogation back in Sao Paulo, he sat completely still in a metal chair, speaking in the exact same polite, calm voice he used to lure his victims, and he confessed to everything. He asked for a piece of paper, and he drew highly detailed maps of Parque do Estado, marking the exact locations of the bodies hidden deep in the thick brush. The police took his hand-drawn maps into the forest and recovered the remains of 11 different women. In August of 1998, Francisco de Assis Pereira was officially charged with the murders. He went to trial and was eventually sentenced to over 260 years in prison. But under Brazilian law at the time, the absolute maximum time a person could legally serve behind bars was 30 years, meaning that despite the massive scale of his crimes, he would eventually be legally eligible for release. And while Francisco used a sprawling open forest filled with trees and sunlight right in the middle of a bustling city to trap his victims, sometimes the most inescapable traps are not out in the open air at all. Sometimes they are built deep underground, completely enclosed in concrete, where the natural light never shines, and the crowds walking just a few feet above have absolutely no idea what is happening right beneath their shoes. On a Thursday morning in late March of 1998, 13-year-old Tristan Brubach was getting ready for school in the Hochst district of Frankfurt, Germany. And Hochst was a very old, deeply industrial part of the city. It was built heavily around large chemical plants and manufacturing hubs, so it was a very working-class, practical neighborhood. And Tristan lived in a small, quiet apartment with his father, Bernd. His mother had passed away several years earlier after a long illness, so it had just been the two of them for a very long time. And Bernd worked long, demanding hours to provide for them, which meant Tristan was very independent. He wore his house key on a dark string around his neck. He knew how to get himself up, get his breakfast, and get himself to the local school on time. He was a quiet kid. He struggled a bit with his classes, but he was incredibly gentle. He loved animals. He spent a lot of time walking his dog around the neighborhood, and he had a very tight, small group of friends. So on the morning of March 26th, Tristan put on his favorite blue jacket. He laced up his favorite pair of dark sneakers. He grabbed his heavy backpack, and he headed out the door. He walked the familiar route through the busy streets of Frankfurt to his school. But as the morning went on, Tristan started to feel unwell. He went to his teachers and complained of a very sharp, persistent pain in his back. And by 1:30 in the afternoon, the pain was bothering him enough that his teachers gave him permission to leave school early and go see a doctor. Tristan walked out of the main doors of the school and headed out into the city. But instead of going straight to the local clinic or walking directly home, he wandered toward the Hochst train station. And this train station was the absolute beating heart of the district. It was a massive, sprawling transit hub with multiple platforms, heavy freight trains constantly rolling through, and thousands of commuters, students, and workers moving through the area every single hour. And Tristan liked to spend time around the station. He liked watching the trains, and he liked looking at the small shops in the main terminal. At around 3:20 in the afternoon, several people saw Tristan sitting by himself on a green metal bench right outside the station. He was just resting his heavy backpack next to him, watching the crowds walk past. He eventually got up, walked over to a public payphone, and picked up the receiver. He dialed his father's workplace, likely to tell him that his back hurt and he was heading home early. But Bernd was busy, and the call did not connect. So Tristan hung the phone up. He put his hands in his pockets, and he started walking away from the main terminal. Now, to get from the train station back to his apartment building, Tristan had to take a very specific shortcut that almost everyone in the neighborhood used, and this was the Liederbach Underpass. It was a long, subterranean concrete pedestrian tunnel that was built directly underneath the massive, heavy train tracks. But it was not just a simple walkway. A small, shallow creek called the Liederbach ran right down the exact center of the tunnel. So inside this long concrete tube, there was a raised concrete walkway on the left, a raised concrete walkway on the right, and the dark water of the creek flowing right between them. The metal railings were rusted and the concrete walls were completely covered in thick, overlapping layers of bright spray paint and graffiti. And because it was built directly under the tracks, it was incredibly loud inside. Every time a freight train rolled overhead, the entire tunnel would shake, and the heavy metallic screeching of the wheels would completely drown out any other sound. But despite being dark and loud, it was the fastest way to cross under the tracks. Kids rode their bikes through it, people walked their dogs through it, and workers used it to get to the factories. It was almost never completely empty for more than 5 or 10 minutes. At exactly 3:30 in the afternoon, Tristan walked down the concrete ramp, stepped into the shadows of the Liederbach underpass, and disappeared from the sunlight. About 15 minutes later, at 3:45, 3 young children were walking home from school. They were laughing and talking as they walked down the exact same concrete ramp and stepped into the tunnel. The air inside was cool and damp. They walked along the right side concrete path right next to the metal railing that separated the walkway from the shallow creek. And as they were walking, one of the kids looked over the railing and down toward the water. And he stopped walking. Lying on the lower concrete embankment right at the edge of the dark water was a heavy school backpack. And just a few feet away from the backpack, lying completely still on the hard concrete, was a young boy. The kids stared over the railing. The tunnel was relatively dark, but they could see that the boy was not moving at all. They yelled out to him, asking if he was okay, but he did not answer. So they panicked. They turned around, sprinted back up the concrete ramp, and ran out into the bright afternoon sun. They ran down the sidewalk until they found a woman walking toward the station, and they frantically told her that there was a dead boy down in the dark water of the underpass. The woman immediately pulled out her phone and called the police. Within minutes, the first patrol cars arrived at the Hux train station. The officers parked their cars, grabbed their radios, and jogged down the concrete ramp into the tunnel. Now, normally when police respond to a call of a person down in a public transit tunnel, they expect to find someone who has collapsed from a medical emergency or perhaps someone who was mugged and left unconscious. But as the officers walked down the path and looked over the rusted metal railing, they stopped completely. They immediately unclipped their radios and called for the homicide squad, the forensic units, and every available officer in the district to secure the station. Because what they were looking at was not a medical emergency. Tristan was lying flat on the concrete. He had been heavily strangled until he lost consciousness. But that was not what made the veteran officers freeze in their tracks. After Tristan had been strangled, the person who attacked him had pulled out a knife, and they had performed a highly complex, deeply systematic surgical procedure on him. The killer had made incredibly precise, deep cuts, and they had methodically drained his blood, and they had dragged him right to the edge of the water to wash the area clean. But as the crime scene technicians arrived and set up their heavy portable lights in the dim tunnel, they noticed a detail that made absolutely no sense. Lying perfectly flat, completely clean, and arranged completely parallel to each other right on top of Tristan's body were his own dark sneakers. The killer had deliberately taken them off during the attack. And then, after completing a highly complex and physically demanding surgical mutilation, the killer did not just drop the knife and run away. They deliberately paused. They picked up the shoes, walked over to the body, and arranged them neatly on top of him before leaving. And the detectives stood in the tunnel and looked at their watches. It was the middle of the afternoon. The timeline was incredibly narrow. Tristan was seen on the green bench at 3:20. He entered the tunnel at 3:30. The kids found him at 3:45, which meant that in a window of just 15 minutes, while hundreds of people were walking past the entrances up on the street, and while commuter trains were pulling into the station right above their heads, someone had walked down into this tunnel and intercepted Tristan. They had overpowered him without making enough noise to draw attention. They had performed a surgical procedure that required intense concentration, absolute physical control, and a deep, practical understanding of human anatomy. They had washed their hands in the creek, arranged the shoes with incredible care, and then they had simply walked up the concrete ramp, stepped back out into the bright sunlight, and completely melted into the busy afternoon crowd. And they did all of this without a single witness seeing anyone covered in blood walking away from the station. The Frankfurt Police Department immediately launched the largest manhunt in the history of Germany. They shut down the entire transit hub. They brought in massive search teams with tracking dogs. They scoured the creek for miles in both directions, looking for the murder weapon, which experts determined was likely a Czech-manufactured utility knife. But the knife was gone. The killer had taken it with them. But the killer had made one mistake. When the forensic team carefully packed up Tristan's belongings from the damp concrete, they analyzed his heavy backpack. The killer had rummaged through the bag, pulling out several of Tristan's school books and tossing them on the ground. And on the glossy, laminated cover of one of those heavy textbooks, the technicians found a single, perfect, bloody fingerprint. And they also recovered a small, distinct profile of foreign DNA left at the scene. The police had the physical identity of the killer sitting right on their desks. So they ran the fingerprint through the National Criminal Database. They ran it through the databases of neighboring countries. They expected a hit immediately, assuming that someone capable of this level of precision and extreme violence must have a massive criminal record. But the computer returned 0 matches. The fingerprint belonged to a complete ghost. So the police decided to force the killer out into the open. They implemented an unprecedented strategy. They ordered a massive, district-wide DNA sweep. Detectives physically knocked on doors all over the Hux district. They went to the chemical factories, the train yards, the local businesses, and the apartment buildings. They demanded saliva swabs from thousands and thousands of men living and working in the area. They specifically targeted local butchers, surgeons, and hunters, anyone who would possess the anatomical knowledge required to do what was done in that tunnel. They took DNA samples from over 10,000 individuals. At the same time, detectives began tracking down every single person who had been near the train station that afternoon. And several independent witnesses came forward with the exact same story. They said that shortly before 3:30, they had seen a man in his late 20s or early 30s sitting on a bench near the entrance to the Liederbach underpass. He had pale skin, a distinct scar on his upper lip, and his dark hair was tied back in a very tight ponytail. And multiple people noted that he was staring intensely down the concrete ramp into the shadows of the tunnel, just watching the people walk in and out. The police brought in a sketch artist, generated a composite drawing of the man with the ponytail, and plastered it on every television screen and newspaper across Europe. A few weeks later, Bernd Brubach sat in his quiet apartment, completely surrounded by the belongings of his only son, waiting for the phone to ring. He waited for the police to tell him that the 10,000 DNA swabs had found the man. He waited for them to say the fingerprint was matched, but the call never came. The massive DNA dragnet, which cost millions of dollars and consumed the entire police force for months, turned up absolutely nothing. Every single butcher, doctor, and local worker was cleared. The composite sketch of the man with the ponytail generated thousands of tips, but none of them led to a suspect. The killer was not in the database, and he was not living in the district. The daylight murder of Tristan Brubach on March 26, 1998, remains one of the most baffling and heavily investigated cold cases in the archives of the Federal Criminal Police Office. The police have the exact fingerprint and the exact DNA of the man who did it. But to this day, they have absolutely no idea who he is, why he took those shoes off, or how he managed to walk out of a crowded concrete tunnel in the middle of the afternoon and completely vanish from the face of the earth. And while a dark subterranean tunnel under a bustling city can conceal a person just long enough for them to disappear, sometimes the most devastating secrets are not hidden in the dark at all. Sometimes they are written down on a plain piece of paper sitting right out in the open, just waiting for someone to finally understand what they mean. On a warm Sunday afternoon, August 16th, 1998, 4-year-old Kevin Hjalmarsson was playing outside his family's apartment in Arvika, Sweden. And Arvika is a very heavily wooded, deeply industrial town situated right on the edge of a massive lake system. So it is the kind of place where working-class families live in dense apartment blocks, and the children basically treat the entire neighborhood and the surrounding forests as their own personal playground. And in the late 90s, it was incredibly common for kids as young as 4 or 5 to just wander out the front door in the morning and spend the entire day running between the buildings, riding bikes, and playing in the woods without any direct adult supervision. So long as you came back when the street lights turned on or when you heard your parents calling your name from the balcony, you were allowed to roam freely. And Kevin was a very active, highly social little boy. He was wearing dark shorts and a t-shirt, and he spent the early part of the afternoon running around the paved courtyards of the apartment complex, playing with a large group of neighborhood kids. But, as the afternoon wore on, the group of kids slowly started to break apart. Some of them went inside for lunch, some of them wandered off to other parts of the complex. And Kevin eventually ended up migrating down away from the apartment buildings and toward the shoreline of a large inlet called Kirkviken. And this shoreline was a popular spot for the local kids because there was a lot of tall grass, scattered rocks, and debris washed up from the water to play with. So, by late afternoon, Kevin's parents realized they had not seen him in a few hours. They walked out onto their balcony and called his name, expecting him to come running around the corner of the brick building. But the courtyards were mostly empty, so they walked down the concrete stairs and started checking the local playgrounds. They knocked on the doors of their neighbors, asking if Kevin was inside playing with their children. But every single person said the exact same thing. They had seen Kevin earlier in the day, but they had no idea where he was now. And as the sun started to set and the temperature began to drop, the parents went from being mildly annoyed to deeply concerned. They walked the perimeter of the neighborhood, checking the wooded areas and calling his name into the trees. But there was absolutely no response. So they called the local police. And normally when police get a call about a missing 4-year-old in a town completely surrounded by dense forests and deep water, they immediately mobilize a massive search effort, because the window of time before the elements become a major factor is incredibly short. The police arrived with tracking dogs, and they immediately organized hundreds of local volunteers from the neighborhood. People brought heavy flashlights and lined up shoulder to shoulder, slowly sweeping through the woods, checking the drainage ditches, and walking along the shoreline of the lake. The air was filled with the sounds of radios crackling and people shouting Kevin's name over and over again. And at around 9:30 that night, the search teams were moving through a very dark, overgrown section of the Kirkviken shoreline, just a few hundred yards from the apartment complex. And one of the volunteers swept his flashlight beam over a patch of tall reeds near the water. The light caught something lying on the ground. The volunteer stopped walking, took a few steps closer, and called out for the police. Lying in the grass, resting directly on top of a discarded, weathered wooden shipping pallet, was 4-year-old Kevin. He was lying on his back, and he was completely motionless. The police officers rushed over and checked for a pulse, but his skin was cold. He was gone. The police immediately cordoned off the entire shoreline with thick yellow tape, pushing the crowds of volunteers back toward the apartment buildings. The forensic teams arrived with heavy portable generator lights, completely illuminating the area around the wooden pallet. They carefully documented the position of the body. They noted that Kevin's clothes were slightly damp, but he was not soaked through as if he had drowned. And as they scoured the ground immediately surrounding the pallet, they bagged several pieces of potential evidence. They picked up an empty soda can, a discarded plastic bag, and a small jagged piece of a broken tree branch that was lying in the grass just a few inches from the wooden boards. It looked like completely random debris that had just washed up from the lake, but the crime scene technicians placed it into a heavy brown evidence bag anyway. The body was transported to the medical examiner, and the autopsy results completely changed the trajectory of the entire town. Kevin had not suffered a medical emergency, and he had not accidentally fallen into the lake and drowned. The physical examination showed clear, distinct petechial hemorrhaging in his eyes and heavy bruising along his neck and chest. He had been forcefully suffocated. It was a homicide. And this realization sent an absolute shockwave through Arvika. The idea that someone would violently strangle a 4-year-old boy in broad daylight just a few hundred yards from a crowded apartment complex was completely unfathomable. The police department set up a massive command center, and they pulled in detectives from neighboring jurisdictions to help handle the sheer volume of interviews. They decided to systematically interview every single person who had been anywhere near the shoreline that afternoon. They set up heavy tables in the station, cross-referencing names, times, and locations, trying to build a minute-by-minute timeline of who was down by the water. And as they sifted through the hundreds of witness statements, a very specific pattern began to emerge. Several different people mentioned seeing a pair of local brothers playing near the lake around the exact time Kevin went missing. And these brothers were very young. One of them was 5 years old, and the older brother was 7 years old. They lived in the same neighborhood, and they were known to play with Kevin on occasion. So, the detectives reached out to the parents of the two brothers and asked if they could bring the boys down to the station just to ask them a few routine questions about what they might have seen while they were playing by the water. The parents agreed, assuming the police were just trying to gather background information. They brought the 5-year-old and the 7-year-old into the heavy concrete police station. The detectives put the boys in a small interview room, and they had the parents wait outside in the hallway. And this is where the investigation took an incredibly dark and highly aggressive turn. The detectives leading the case had developed a very rigid absolute theory. They believed that because no adults were specifically seen interacting with Kevin at the exact time of the murder, The only people who could have done it were the other children playing nearby. They hypothesized that the children had gotten into a minor argument over a toy or a game, and the older boys had pushed Kevin down and suffocated him. So the plainclothes detectives sat across from these two tiny children whose feet could not even touch the floor from the heavy plastic chairs they were sitting in, and they began to interrogate them. But they did not use child psychology experts, and they did not allow legal representation in the room. They simply applied standard, highly aggressive adult interrogation tactics on a 5-year-old and a 7-year-old. And they did not just do this once. Over the course of the next several months, the police brought these two toddlers back into the station for over 30 separate, agonizingly long interrogation sessions. The detectives would separate the boys, keeping them in different rooms for hours at a time. They would ask them the same questions over and over again, completely exhausting them. "You were down by the water with Kevin, weren't you?" the detective would ask, leaning heavily over the table. "We were playing," the 7-year-old would say, looking down at his hands. "But you got mad at him, didn't you? You pushed him down onto the pallet." "No, we just played." "We know what you did. We have people who saw you do it. You need to tell us the truth right now." And this unrelenting pressure went on for weeks. The children were completely exhausted. They were crying, they were confused, and they desperately wanted to just go home to their parents. But the detectives refused to let up. They began feeding the children highly specific details from the crime scene, completely warping their young, malleable memories. They would tell the boys exactly where Kevin was found, exactly how he was positioned, and they strongly suggested that the boys had been the ones to put him there. And finally, after months of isolation and psychological breaking, the police got what they wanted. They walked out of the interview rooms, stood in front of the local and national press, and made a massive announcement. They declared that the 5-year-old and the 7-year-old brothers had officially confessed to the murder of Kevin Hjalmarsson. The police stated that the boys had admitted to pushing Kevin down, holding him against the wooden pallet, and suffocating him until he stopped moving. The entire country of Sweden was absolutely stunned. The idea of two toddlers committing a cold-blooded murder was heavily broadcast across every major news network. The boys were immediately removed from their parents' custody by the state. They were isolated in specialized youth psychiatric facilities, heavily medicated, and subjected to intense behavioral therapy. Their family was completely ostracized from the community of Arvika. They received constant threats. Their property was vandalized, and they were forced to live as the parents of child murderers. The police closed the file considering the case completely solved, and the town tried to move on from the unbelievable tragedy of children killing children. And for nearly 2 decades, that was the absolute, unquestioned truth. The brothers grew up in the system carrying the incredibly heavy, dark label of murderers living completely fractured lives. But in 2017, a prominent Swedish investigative journalist decided to look back into the Kevin Hjalmarsson case. He wanted to understand the psychological mechanics of how children that young could commit such a violent act. So he petitioned the courts and legally obtained the original unedited VHS tapes of the police interrogations from 1998. He expected to see remorseless confessions from troubled kids. But as he sat in his office and pushed the heavy plastic tapes into the VCR, he saw something else entirely. The journalist watched hours and hours of footage showing 2 exhausted, crying toddlers desperately trying to please the towering, angry detectives in the room. He watched the detectives aggressively ignore the boys every time they explicitly denied hurting Kevin. And most importantly, he watched the exact moment the police fabricated the murder weapon. During one of the final interrogations, the lead detective pulled out a heavy brown evidence bag. He reached inside and placed a small, jagged piece of a broken tree branch onto the metal table. It was the exact same piece of random debris the forensic team had picked up from the grass near the wooden pallet on the night of the search. The detective pointed a heavy finger at the stick and looked right at the 5-year-old. "You used this to press down on his neck, didn't you?" The 5-year-old just stared at the broken wood, completely exhausted, tears running down his face. He shook his head slowly. "Yes, you did. You used this stick. Tell me you used the stick." The little boy looked at the door, hoping his mother would walk in, but the door stayed shut. So he looked back at the detective, and he just nodded. That single, completely coerced nod over a random piece of forest debris was what the police had categorized as a full, legally binding confession. There was no physical evidence linking the boys to the crime. There was no DNA. There was no witness. The entire case, the absolute destruction of their family, And the narrative that captivated an entire country was built entirely on aggressive police officers feeding a false reality to children who were simply too young to fight back. The journalist immediately published a massive multi-part documentary exposing the entire catastrophic failure of the investigation. The public reaction was explosive. Legal scholars, child psychologists, and the general public demanded absolute accountability. The Swedish government was forced to completely reopen the case and assign an independent team of new investigators to review every single page of the original files. And in the spring of 2018, 20 years after Kevin was found on that wooden pallet, the Swedish police authority held a highly publicized press conference. They officially exonerated the two brothers, completely clearing them of any suspicion in the death of Kevin Hjalmarsson. They publicly admitted that the interrogations were highly coercive, legally invalid, and an absolute violation of basic human rights. The brothers, now adult men in their late 20s, were finally free from the label that had destroyed their entire lives. But the exoneration carried a devastating, incredibly dark realization for the town of Arvika. Because the police had spent all of their time aggressively targeting two innocent toddlers, they had completely ignored any other leads. They never looked for anyone else, which meant that the person who actually walked down to the shoreline on that August afternoon and violently suffocated a 4-year-old boy simply walked away, and they have never been found. And while the deep woods around Arvika provided the perfect cover for a terrible crime to go completely unnoticed, sometimes you do not need the isolation of a forest to hide a massive, unbelievable secret. Sometimes a secret can be buried right in the middle of a massive, heavily regulated corporate industry hidden inside millions of tons of solid rock. In the early spring of 1993, David Walsh was sitting in the unfinished basement of his small, incredibly quiet house in Calgary, Canada, and he was completely broke. He was 47 years old, and he had spent his entire professional life working as a mid-level stockbroker and trying to launch various small mining exploration companies. But every single venture he had attempted over the last decade had failed. He was buried under tens of thousands of dollars in high-interest credit card debt. He had multiple mortgages on his small home, and his personal bank accounts were virtually empty. So he spent his days sitting in the dim light of his basement, staring at a massive stack of unpaid bills, while his wife and kids went about their daily routines upstairs. And his only remaining asset in the entire world was a tiny, completely inactive shell company called BreX Minerals. It was a penny stock that traded for just a few cents a share, and it had absolutely no physical assets, no active mining sites, and barely any employees. So David knew he was running out of time before the banks officially foreclosed on his home. He needed a massive, unprecedented discovery to save himself. And he remembered hearing rumors about an incredibly remote, totally unproven stretch of jungle in Indonesia called Busang. So he picked up his phone, maxed out his very last credit card to buy a plane ticket, and he flew halfway across the world to Jakarta. And when he arrived in Indonesia, he set up a meeting with a man named Michael de Guzman. Now, de Guzman was an incredibly charismatic, highly ambitious geologist from the Philippines. He was known in the industry as someone who was brilliant at reading geological maps, but he was also known for being a very heavy drinker and a constant gambler. And when the two men sat down in a humid hotel lobby, de Guzman unrolled a massive topographical map of the Borneo rainforest. He pointed his finger directly at the Busang region, and he told David that the major mining conglomerates had completely overlooked this specific area. He said that the unique volcanic rock formations deep underground strongly indicated that there was a massive, untouched deposit of gold sitting right beneath the trees. David looked at the map, and he looked at the sheer confidence in de Guzman's face. He had absolutely no money to pay him an actual salary. So he offered de Guzman a massive block of shares in his worthless penny stock, BreX Minerals, and a percentage of whatever they found in the ground. De Guzman agreed immediately. So in early 1994, de Guzman traveled deep into the Busang jungle to set up the very first BreX exploration camp. And to give you an idea of how incredibly remote this location was, you could not just drive a truck there. You had to take a small bush plane to a dirt airstrip, and then you had to travel for days in a motorized wooden canoe up a winding, muddy river, completely surrounded by towering trees and massive ferns. The heat was absolutely suffocating. The air was thick with malaria-carrying mosquitoes, and the mud was so deep that it would routinely swallow heavy equipment. But de Guzman hired a crew of local laborers and they hacked a clearing out of the thick brush. They brought in heavy diesel-powered drill rigs and they started boring massive holes, hundreds of feet straight down into the earth. And the drilling process was incredibly slow and loud. The heavy steel bits would grind through the bedrock, pulling up long cylindrical pieces of solid gray stone called core samples. These heavy tubes of rock were the only way to know what was actually in the ground. The crew would pull the wet gray rock out of the drill, lay it out on long wooden tables under a heavy canvas tent, and wait for de Guzman to inspect it. And as de Guzman stood in the heavy mud, leaning over the wooden tables and examining the very first pieces of rock pulled from the earth, he reached out and traced his finger along the damp stone. And on his left hand, he wore a very thick, distinctive gold wedding band. It was a heavy, bright piece of jewelry that caught the sunlight filtering through the trees. But over the next few months, the local workers in the camp started to notice something strange. De Guzman's thick ring was looking incredibly worn down. The outer surface of the band was covered in deep parallel scratches, and the metal itself was getting noticeably thinner and duller every single week. But nobody really questioned it because the camp was suddenly gripped by absolute euphoria. After the crew would pull the long cylinders of rock out of the ground, they would use heavy steel crushers to grind the rock into a fine gray powder. They would seal that powder into heavy canvas bags, zip the bags shut, and fly them out of the jungle to an independent assay laboratory in the city of Balikpapan. And when the very first lab reports came back in late 1995, the results were staggering. The laboratory confirmed that the crushed rock from the Busong site contained highly concentrated commercial-grade gold. David Walsh was sitting in his basement in Calgary when he got the facts from the laboratory. He immediately drafted a massive press release and sent it to every financial news outlet in North America. He announced that Bre-X Minerals had officially struck gold in Indonesia, and the reaction from the stock market was instantaneous. The obscure penny stock, which had been trading for just 30 cents, suddenly jumped to $2. And as the drill rigs in the jungle kept boring new holes, the lab reports kept coming back with even higher concentrations of gold. The estimates of the deposit grew rapidly. First, they announced there were 2 million ounces of gold buried in the mud. A few months later, de Guzman stood in front of a camera at the jungle camp, wiping sweat from his forehead, and declared there were 30 million ounces. And the stock price absolutely exploded. It went from $2 to $20, and then to $200 a share. Bre-X Minerals transformed almost overnight from a bankrupt shell company into a multi-billion-dollar corporate empire. David Walsh moved out of his unfinished basement and into a massive, sprawling mansion in the wealthiest neighborhood in Calgary. He bought luxury cars, flew on private jets, and moved his company headquarters into a massive glass tower downtown. The world's largest investment banks, including Lehman Brothers and JP Morgan, sent their top analysts on private helicopters to fly over the thick green canopy of Borneo, looking down at the tiny, muddy clearing, completely convinced they were looking at the richest piece of land on the face of the earth. People all over Canada and the United States were literally mortgaging their homes, draining their life savings, and borrowing heavily just to buy shares of Bre-X. At its peak, the company was valued at over $6 billion. But there was a massive, incredibly dark reality hiding underneath all of that money. The Busong jungle did not contain the largest gold deposit in human history. In fact, it did not contain any gold at all. The heavy gray core samples that the massive drill rigs pulled out of the earth every single day were completely worthless rock. And the entire $6 billion empire was built on a highly systematic, incredibly audacious physical deception taking place inside the canvas sample tent in the dead of night. Every evening after the heavy diesel engines of the drill rigs were shut down and the local crew had gone to sleep in their bunks, Michael de Guzman would walk alone into the secure processing tent. He would turn on a small battery-powered lantern, and he would walk over to the heavy canvas bags filled with the crushed, worthless gray rock that was scheduled to be flown to the lab the next morning. He would slowly unzip the heavy bags. He would reach into his pocket and he would pull out a small steel metal file. And then he would take off his wedding ring. De Guzman would hold the thick gold band directly over the open bag of crushed stone. He would press the rough steel file against the edge of the jewelry, and he would forcefully scrape it back and forth. Tiny microscopic flakes of pure gold would shave off the ring and fall directly into the gray powder. He would mix the dust in with his hands, zip the bag back up, and walk out of the tent. He was literally salting the earth. When the independent lab in the city received the bags, they would run their standard chemical tests, find the tiny flakes of gold that de Guzman had manually dropped in, and issue a massive certified report verifying the strike. But as the sheer scale of the lie grew, and the company needed to report even larger concentrations of gold to keep the stock price climbing, de Guzman could no longer just rely on shaving his own jewelry. His ring was getting too thin. So he began quietly taking small riverboats to remote local villages outside the mining zone. He would pay the local residents cash for small vials of raw panned gold dust that they had washed out of the local riverbed. He would smuggle these vials back to the camp in his pockets, and at night, he would pour hundreds of dollars of local river gold directly into the Brie X sample bags. And those bags, heavily salted with cheap river dust, would be flown to the lab and immediately generate billions of dollars in stock market value. And for nearly 3 years, the scam worked perfectly. De Guzman lived like an absolute king in Indonesia, keeping multiple wives in different cities and spending massive amounts of cash at high-end casinos. David Walsh lived in complete luxury in Canada, aggressively defending his company against any skeptics. But in early 1997, the sheer size of the massive valuation finally triggered a catastrophic chain of events. The Indonesian government, led by President Suharto, realized that a foreign company was sitting on $6 billion of natural resources inside their borders. So the government stepped in and completely froze Brie X's permits. They told David Walsh that if he wanted to keep mining, he had to legally partner with a massive, highly established American mining conglomerate called Freeport-McMoRan, and the government demanded that Freeport take over the physical operation of the site to ensure the gold was extracted efficiently. David had no choice but to agree. So in March of 1997, Freeport sent their own massive team of highly trained independent geologists and security personnel deep into the Busang jungle. And they did not just look at de Guzman's paperwork. They brought in their own heavy drill rigs. They set them up just a few feet away from the original Brie X holes, and they started pulling up their own cylindrical core samples. De Guzman panicked. He watched the massive American crew operating under heavy security protocols. He knew he could not get anywhere near their canvas bags in the middle of the night. He could not salt their samples. A few weeks later, the Freeport geologists ran their preliminary tests on the new rock. They found absolutely nothing. There was no gold, not a single trace. The executives at Freeport immediately picked up a satellite phone and called David Walsh in Calgary. They told him that his multi-billion-dollar site appeared to be completely barren. David, desperately trying to protect his stock, immediately called de Guzman, who was staying in a luxury hotel in the city of Balikpapan. David demanded that de Guzman fly back to the jungle camp the very next morning to personally meet with the Freeport geologists and explain the massive discrepancy in the data. De Guzman agreed. On the morning of March 19th, 1997, de Guzman walked out to the local airstrip in Balikpapan. He was wearing a dark, heavy suit, which was completely out of place for a trip into the sweltering jungle. He was carrying a small black bag. He walked across the tarmac and climbed into the back seat of a small Alouette 3 helicopter that had been chartered for the flight. The pilot strapped himself into the front right seat, and the flight mechanic sat in the front left. De Guzman was completely alone in the rear cabin. The helicopter lifted off the hot concrete and banked heavily toward the dark green interior of the island. And the flight path took them directly over the absolute thickest, most impenetrable sections of the Borneo rainforest. They were cruising at exactly 800 feet. The air was incredibly humid, and the noise inside the small cabin from the massive overhead rotor was deafening. The pilot kept his eyes locked on the horizon, monitoring his instruments, while the mechanic looked out the front glass. About 20 minutes into the flight, a massive, violent rush of wind suddenly tore through the cabin. The sudden change in air pressure caused the entire helicopter to shudder violently. The pilot immediately grabbed the controls to stabilize the aircraft, and he quickly looked back over his right shoulder. The heavy, sliding side door of the helicopter was wide open. The wind was screaming into the empty back seat. De Guzman was gone. The pilot immediately banked the helicopter into a steep dive, circling frantically over the endless, unbroken canopy of massive green trees below. But there was absolutely nothing to see. Just a solid ocean of leaves. He grabbed his radio and frantically called air traffic control to report a man overboard. It took specialized jungle search and rescue teams 4 grueling days of hacking through the thick brush to finally find the impact site. Deep in the mud, surrounded by shattered branches, they found the heavily decomposed remains of Michael de Guzman. He had fallen 800 feet directly into the primary canopy. When investigators searched the small black bag he had left, resting on his seat in the helicopter, they found a handwritten suicide note. In the letter, de Guzman claimed he was suffering from an incurable medical condition and could no longer bear the pain. He did not mention a single word about the gold. But his death triggered an absolute avalanche. Trading of Briac stock was instantly halted on the major exchanges. An independent, highly respected auditing firm called Strathcona Minerals was immediately hired to go to the jungle camp and conduct a massive forensic review of every single piece of rock that had ever been pulled out of the ground. And when Strathcona Minerals finally released their massive, devastating final report, they explained exactly how the $6 billion fraud was committed. They noted that gold formed naturally inside deep bedrock has incredibly distinct jagged edges when viewed under a microscope. But the gold found in the Briac sample bags was perfectly rounded and smooth, proving it had spent centuries tumbling in a riverbed before being manually poured into the bags. And if you recall that incredibly heavy, scratched piece of jewelry de Guzman wore on his left hand, the auditors completely shattered the illusion with one specific, undeniable detail. They noted that the trace amounts of gold found in the very earliest samples from 1994 were not naturally occurring river gold at all. The microscopic flakes were heavily alloyed with copper and silver, and the specific metallurgical profile of that alloy perfectly matched the exact commercial blend used to manufacture standard gold wedding rings. The man had literally built the largest financial fraud in the history of the mining industry by aggressively filing down his own jewelry and dropping the dust into the dirt. The very next morning, the Briac stock price completely collapsed. It plummeted from billions of dollars in total value down to a fraction of a single penny in a matter of hours. Institutional investors, massive pension funds, and thousands of ordinary people lost absolutely everything. David Walsh completely denied having any knowledge of the salting operation. He claimed he was just as much of a victim as the shareholders. He quietly moved to a massive luxury estate in the Bahamas, where he died of a sudden brain aneurysm just 1 year later. And while the deep, isolated canopy of the Borneo jungle provided the absolute perfect cover to build a multi-billion-dollar lie in total darkness, sometimes the most unbelievable crimes do not rely on shadows or isolation. Sometimes the most brazen, highly destructive events happen right out in the open on the bright, sunny streets of a major American city where two heavily armored men decided to go to war on live television. On the morning of February 28, 1997, the San Fernando Valley in Los Angeles was waking up to a completely clear, warm Southern California day, and the commercial district of North Hollywood was already incredibly busy. The intersection of Laurel Canyon Boulevard and Archwood Street was packed with morning commuter traffic, delivery trucks, and people walking to work. And sitting right on the corner of that busy intersection was a large, flat-roofed concrete branch of the Bank of America. The bank manager arrived at his normal time, unlocking the heavy double-glass doors at the front of the building and turning on the overhead fluorescent lights. The tellers began taking their positions behind the long wooden counter, organizing their cash drawers and booting up their computer terminals. The vault manager walked into the secure back room to check the time locks on the massive steel safe. They were expecting a very specific delivery that morning. An armored truck was scheduled to arrive and drop off over $1 million in cash to supply the automated teller machines for the upcoming weekend. The bank was fully staffed. The coffee maker in the break room was running, and the first customers of the day were starting to filter through the front doors to deposit their paychecks and handle their accounts. Now, just a few miles away from the bank, Los Angeles Police Department officers Lauren Farrell and Martin Perello were just starting their morning patrol shift. They were sitting in a standard black and white police cruiser driving slowly down the wide avenues of the valley. The weather was already pushing into the high 60s, so they had their windows rolled down. They were wearing their standard dark blue uniforms, carrying their department-issued 9mm service pistols on their belts, and they had a standard 12-gauge shotgun locked into the heavy metal rack between the front seats. They were just listening to the quiet static of the dispatch radio, watching the traffic flow and running through the completely normal routine of a Friday morning patrol. But at 8:55 in the morning, a white Chevrolet Celebrity sedan pulled into the rear parking lot of the Bank of America. Larry Phillips Jr. and Emil Matasarianu were sitting inside the car, and they were preparing to walk into the bank. But they were doing something in the front seats of that car that made absolutely no sense for the warm, sunny weather outside. They were aggressively layering on incredibly thick, oversized, baggy winter clothing. Emil pulled a heavy, dark canvas jacket over a long-sleeved button-down shirt that was at least 3 sizes too big for his frame. Larry pulled on a thick gray sweater and heavy, dark cargo pants that bunched up heavily around his heavy work boots. They looked like they were dressing for a severe winter blizzard in the middle of a California morning. Larry reached into the center console and pulled out a small plastic pill bottle. They each took a heavy dose of phenobarbital, which is a powerful central nervous system depressant. They dry swallowed the pills to completely slow their heart rates, stop their hands from shaking, and dull any potential physical pain. And then they reached into the back seat of the sedan. They pulled out heavily modified illegal assault rifles. Larry grabbed a Norinco Type 56, which is a Chinese variant of the AK-47. He had specifically modified the internal firing mechanism to make the weapon fully automatic. And to ensure he did not have to stop to reload, he had taken 2 massive, heavy steel drum magazines, each holding 75 rounds of armor-piercing ammunition, and he had heavily wrapped them together with thick electrical tape. Emil grabbed a similar automatic rifle, checking the heavy bolt and slinging the thick canvas strap over his oversized jacket. At exactly 9:17 in the morning, the 2 men pulled black ski masks over their faces, stepped out of the white sedan, and started walking with heavy, deliberate steps toward the glass doors of the bank. And right at that exact second, Officers Farrell and Perello were driving their cruiser right past the bank on Laurel Canyon Boulevard. Farrell looked out his passenger window toward the parking lot. He saw 2 large men in thick, completely inappropriate winter clothing and ski masks pushing their way through the bank doors carrying heavy rifles. He immediately grabbed his shoulder radio. He pressed the button and told the dispatcher they had a 211 in progress, an armed robbery at the Bank of America. Perello slammed his foot on the brake, flipped on the heavy overhead lights, and swung the cruiser around to block the intersection. Now, inside the bank, there were over 30 customers and employees standing in the main lobby. Larry and Emil walked through the doors, raised their heavy rifles, and immediately squeezed the triggers. They fired a massive, continuous burst of automatic gunfire directly into the plaster ceiling. The sound inside the enclosed concrete building was completely deafening. Heavy pieces of shattered plaster, metal light fixtures, and dust rained down heavily onto the floor. Larry screamed at everyone to get down on their faces. The customers and tellers dropped to the carpet, covering their heads. Larry did not wait for anyone to hand him the keys to the secure teller area. He walked right up to the heavy reinforced door, separating the lobby from the employees, pointed his rifle at the locking mechanism, and simply shot it completely off the hinges. He walked behind the counter, grabbed the assistant manager by the collar of his shirt, and shoved him violently toward the back room. He demanded that the manager open the main vault immediately. The manager was shaking so heavily he could barely turn the dial, but he finally entered the combination and pulled the heavy steel lever. The thick vault door swung open. But when Larry looked inside the brightly lit safe, he realized his timing was completely wrong. The massive armored truck delivery they had built their entire plan around had not arrived yet. Instead of the $1 million they had planned to take, the shelves were mostly empty. There was only about $300,000 in banded stacks of small bills. Larry became highly agitated. He started yelling at the manager, forcing him to grab a heavy canvas duffel bag and stuff the remaining cash inside. He specifically warned the manager not to include any explosive die packs. But as Emil was standing near the front of the lobby watching the street through the shattered glass doors, he saw the flashing red and blue lights of Farrell and Perello's cruiser reflecting off the pavement outside. And then he saw a second police car pull up. And then a third. Emil called out to Larry over the sound of the crying customers. He told him they were completely surrounded. The standard Los Angeles Police Department protocol for a surrounded, barricaded bank robbery was very strict. The patrol officers were supposed to establish a hard perimeter, take cover behind their vehicles, call for the specialized SWAT unit, and wait for the robbers to pick up a phone inside the bank to start negotiating a surrender. The police expected a long, drawn-out standoff. But Larry and Emil had absolutely no intention of negotiating. They did not look for a back exit, and they did not try to take any hostages. Larry grabbed the heavy canvas duffel bag filled with the cash. Emil racked the charging handle on his rifle. And the 2 men simply turned around, walked away from the terrified customers, and headed straight for the front doors. It is 9:24 in the morning. Larry Phillips steps out through the shattered glass doors of the bank, and he walks right out onto the bright concrete of the front parking lot. There are over a dozen police cruisers parked out on the street now. The officers are taking cover behind their open car doors, resting their standard-issue 9mm service pistols on the window frames. They yell at Larry to drop his weapon and put his hands on his head. Larry does not even flinch. He does not run for cover, and he does not say a word. He just raises his heavy assault rifle, points it toward the street, and holds the trigger down. He sweeps the entire intersection with a massive, continuous wall of armor-piercing ammunition. The sound is completely overwhelming, echoing heavily off the surrounding commercial buildings. The steel core bullets hit the police cruisers and tear right through the thin metal doors as if they are made of wet paper. The glass windows of the patrol cars completely explode outward in a shower of tiny fragments. The officers realize their car doors offer absolutely no protection, and they are forced to abandon their vehicles and dive flat onto the hot asphalt, crawling behind the heavy engine blocks just to survive. The police return fire immediately. Dozens of officers have a clear, direct line of sight. They aim their 9mm pistols and their 12-gauge shotguns right at Larry's massive torso, and they squeeze their triggers. The bullets hit Larry directly in the chest and the stomach. But Larry does not go down. He does not even stumble backward. The heavy police rounds hit his torso, and they simply bounce off. And that is when the officers lying on the pavement realize the terrible truth about the oversized, thick, baggy winter clothing the two men had put on in the car. The heavy canvas jackets and the thick cargo pants were not to hide their identities, and they were not to keep warm. The baggy clothing was specifically designed to cover incredibly thick, custom-sewn suits of heavy-duty Kevlar body armor. Larry and Emil had taken multiple heavy bulletproof vests, cut them apart, and physically sewn them together to create full-body suits. They had wrapped the Kevlar tightly around their chests, their backs, their shoulders, their arms, and their thighs. They had literally turned themselves into walking completely invulnerable military tanks. Emil steps out of the bank right behind Larry, and he opens fire too. They are standing completely exposed in the parking lot, absorbing direct hits from the police, and they are firing thousands of rounds into the neighborhood. The heavy bullets are tearing through the walls of the surrounding residential houses, shattering the windows of a nearby dental clinic, and completely shredding the trees lining the street. The police are completely outgunned. Every time they fire their handguns, the bullets just flatten against the heavy Kevlar. More patrol cars are arriving by the minute, their sirens wailing in the distance. But the second they pull up to the intersection, Larry simply turns his rifle and fires a long burst directly into the grill of the cruiser completely, destroying the engine and trapping the officers inside. The situation escalates completely out of control. Several officers pinned down the block realize that if they do not get heavier weapons, they are all going to die on the asphalt. So a group of officers gets up, turns away from the bank, and sprints down the street to a local civilian gun store called B&B Sales. They run through the front doors of the shop, heavily out of breath. They flash their badges at the owner, and they demand to commandeer any high-powered rifles the store has in stock. The store owner immediately starts pulling semi-automatic AR-15 rifles off the wooden display racks. He grabs heavy cardboard boxes of 5.56mm ammunition from the shelves and throws them onto the counter. The officers grab the civilian weapons, tear the ammunition boxes open with their hands, and run back down the street to rejoin the firefight. And as the officers are loading the borrowed rifles, a heavy armored rescue vehicle suddenly drives right into the middle of the intersection. The LAPD SWAT team has finally arrived. But because it is their day off, and they had been at the police academy doing their morning physical training, when the call came in, the highly trained tactical officers are pouring out of the back of the armored truck wearing running shoes. Gym shorts and heavy tactical vests thrown hastily over. Their t-shirts. The SWAT officers put the heavy steel of their vehicle right between the robbers and the pinned-down patrol cops. They start grabbing the wounded officers by their belts and dragging them out of the line of fire. The firefight lasts for an unbelievable 44 solid minutes. It is so massive and so loud that local news helicopters are hovering right over the bank, broadcasting the entire apocalyptic street war live on national television. Millions of people are watching as Larry and Emil slowly walk through the parking lot, just reloading their heavy drum magazines and firing endlessly. But Larry finally realizes they cannot just walk away. The police perimeter is too thick. He separates from Emil and tries to walk behind a parked flatbed truck to get a better angle on the SWAT vehicle. He is firing constantly. But as he reaches down to his tactical vest to pull out a fresh magazine, a single police bullet flies past the truck and hits the very tip of Larry's thumb, practically severing it from his hand. Larry drops his heavy rifle onto the pavement. He reaches down and tries to pick it back up to clear a jam in the firing chamber, but his hand cannot grip the heavy metal. He realizes his primary weapon is completely useless. His hand is destroyed, and there are dozens of heavily armed SWAT officers aggressively closing in on his position from behind the truck. Larry pulls a smaller handgun from his belt. He turns the weapon around, places it under his chin, and he pulls the trigger. Down the street, Emil manages to get into the driver's seat of their white Chevrolet. He throws the heavy duffel bag of cash into the passenger seat, turns the key, and tries to drive through the police barricade. But the tires of the sedan are completely shredded to the rims, and the engine has taken dozens of direct hits from the SWAT rifles. He slowly rolls down the street for about 3 blocks, metal sparking against the pavement before the car simply dies. Emil kicks his door open, steps out from behind the steering wheel, and tries to take cover behind the trunk of the car. A team of SWAT officers advances slowly down the street, utilizing the concrete curbs and parked cars for cover. They exchange heavy concentrated fire with Emil for several minutes. But as the SWAT officers look through their rifle scopes, they notice something highly specific about Emil's heavy clothing. The custom Kevlar armor wraps tightly around his chest and his thighs, making his upper body look incredibly massive. But the heavy fabric stops right at the top of his boots. His lower legs are completely unprotected. The SWAT officers drop their aim. They stop firing at his chest, and they point their rifles directly under the chassis of the white car, aiming right for Emil's ankles and shins. They squeeze the triggers, skipping the heavy rounds off the pavement. Multiple bullets hit Emil directly in his unarmored lower legs. Emil instantly drops to the asphalt, unable to stand or support his heavy armor. He throws his hands up, dropping his weapon, and he finally stops shooting. The police hold their perimeter tightly, keeping their weapons trained on him, refusing to move forward. The sheer amount of active gunfire that had just occurred in the area makes it impossible for paramedics to immediately enter the hot zone without the area being completely cleared for explosives. Emil lies on the hot pavement, bleeding heavily from his lower legs, until he finally loses consciousness and bleeds to death. The silence that followed the 44 minutes of continuous gunfire was incredibly heavy. The intersection looked like a completely devastated war zone. The final forensic investigation revealed that Larry Phillips Jr. and Emil Matosarianu had fired over 1,100 rounds of heavy ammunition directly into the residential neighborhood. There were dozens of completely destroyed police cruisers, shattered glass storefronts, and heavily damaged homes. But miraculously, despite the sheer scale of the violence, the thousands of bullets fired, and 20 different people suffering injuries, the only 2 fatalities on February 28, 1997, were the 2 heavily armored bank robbers themselves. And while stepping out of a bank into the bright morning sun wearing 40 pounds of heavy body armor is a highly visible, incredibly aggressive way to wage a war, sometimes the most destructive forces do not announce their presence with automatic gunfire. Sometimes the most devastating events happen in complete silence, high above the clouds, starting with something as small and completely unnoticeable as a single spark. On a humid evening in May of 1996, Victor Lee was sitting in the back of his chauffeur-driven luxury sedan, making his way through the winding, heavily forested roads of Deepwater Bay in Hong Kong. And Deepwater Bay was essentially the absolute most exclusive, incredibly wealthy neighborhood in all of Asia. It was a place where massive, sprawling mansions sat securely behind high iron gates and thick stone walls. And Victor was the eldest son of Li Kexing. And Li Kexing was not just wealthy. He was the single richest man in Asia, a self-made billionaire who controlled major shipping ports, massive telecommunications networks, and expansive real estate empires. He was the ultimate patriarch of the city's economy, and Victor was actively being groomed to take over the entire corporate operation. Victor worked incredibly long hours at the Chung Kong Center, and every evening his driver would take him home along the exact same mountain roads. But despite their unimaginable wealth, the Li family lived a surprisingly structured, relatively low-key life. Li Kexing wore a simple, inexpensive watch, and he deeply believed that his immense status and his contribution to the economy naturally protected his family. So, Victor did not travel with a heavy security detail. He did not have a motorcade of armored vehicles or armed bodyguards following him. He just had his driver, and they took the exact same route home at the exact same time every single night. Now, as Victor's car approached a particularly narrow, sharp curve on the secluded mountain road, a small car suddenly swerved out of the shadows and stalled directly in the middle of the lane. Victor's driver slammed on the brakes, and the second the sedan came to a complete stop, two heavy utility vans pulled up tightly against the rear bumper, completely locking the sedan in place. The sliding doors of the vans opened. 6 men stepped out onto the asphalt. They were wearing dark clothing, and they were holding fully automatic AK-47 assault rifles. They immediately surrounded the sedan. One man pointed his heavy barrel directly at the driver's face through the glass, while another man pulled Victor's door open. They grabbed Victor by the shoulders and dragged him out of the back seat. They wrapped a thick piece of dark fabric completely around his eyes, and they bound his wrists tightly with heavy plastic zip ties. They threw him into the back of one of the heavy vans, slammed the doors shut, and sped away down the mountain, leaving the driver standing completely alone on the dark road. Victor was driven to an abandoned, incredibly remote farm facility in the New Territories. The men took him inside a small concrete outbuilding. They chained his ankle to a heavy metal water pipe on the wall. They stripped him down to his underwear, and they left him sitting on a piece of discarded cardboard in the absolute dark. And the man coordinating this massive operation from a safe distance was named Chung Tse-kung. But he was not a standard low-level criminal looking for a quick payout. He operated completely independently from the traditional triad gangs. And in the massive casinos of Macau, he was known simply as Big Spender. And he earned that name because his addiction to high-stakes gambling was completely unprecedented. He would walk into the highly exclusive VIP rooms of the Casino Lisboa, carrying heavy duffel bags full of physical cash. He would play baccarat, routinely placing bets of several $1,000,000 on a single hand of cards. He would lose $20 or $30 million in a single weekend walk out of the casino without showing any physical emotion and immediately start planning his next heist. But Chung realized that robbing armored bank trucks on the crowded streets of Hong Kong was getting far too difficult. The police response was too fast, the shootouts were highly dangerous, and the amount of money inside the trucks was simply not enough to feed his massive gambling losses. He realized the true liquid wealth of the city was not sitting in the banks. It was sitting inside the private mansions of the untouchable billionaire elite. And he knew these men valued their pristine corporate reputations and the safety of their bloodlines above absolutely everything else. So instead of keeping Victor in a remote warehouse and making a series of untraceable muffled phone calls from public payphones, Chiang did something completely unprecedented. He simply picked up his personal mobile phone and dialed the direct number to Li Ka-shing's primary residence. The billionaire answered the phone himself. Chiang calmly introduced himself. He confirmed that he had Victor, and he explicitly assured Li Ka-shing that his son was currently unharmed. And then Chung said he wanted to discuss the business terms of Victor's safe return. But instead of giving instructions for a massive cash drop in an alleyway, Chung said he was coming over to the house right now so they could speak face to face. He told the billionaire to make sure the heavy iron front gates were open and to ensure there were absolutely no police anywhere near the property. Li Ka-shing agreed. He hung up the phone and he explicitly ordered his private security staff to stand down and unlock the gates. A few hours later, a single car pulled up the long, sweeping driveway of the mansion. Chung Tse-kung got out of the driver's seat. He was completely alone. He walked up the heavy stone steps and approached the massive front doors. And it was late May, which meant the weather in Hong Kong was incredibly hot and heavily humid. But Chung was wearing a very large, bulky windbreaker jacket. It was zipped all the way up to his chin, and the thick nylon fabric was bulging heavily around his torso. The domestic staff opened the doors, and Chung stepped into the quiet, heavily air-conditioned foyer. He smiled politely at the staff and walked directly into the main living room. Li Ka-shing was waiting for him. The two men sat down on expensive leather sofas directly across from each other. The massive house was completely silent. A servant brought a silver tray with a ceramic teapot and 2 small cups, placed it on the low table between them, and quickly exited the room. Li Ka-shing looked across the table at the man sitting on his couch. "How much do you want?" Chiang leaned back into the deep leather cushions. He reached his right hand up to his collar, and he pulled the zipper of his heavy jacket all the way down. He pulled the thick fabric open. And strapped directly to Chiang's chest, wrapped in thick, overlapping layers of gray tape, were dozens of tightly packed blocks of military-grade plastic explosives. Thick wires ran from the gray blocks down into the front pocket of his trousers. Chung rested his hand directly on the manual detonator switch, sitting inside his pocket. He looked back at the billionaire. He explained that if he saw a single police officer outside the windows, or if the financial negotiation failed, he would simply press the button. He stated that the massive amount of explosives would instantly level the entire primary residence, completely destroying the room they were sitting in and killing everyone inside the house. $2 billion, Chung said. Li Ka-shing did not raise his voice. He did not try to argue or plead. He simply picked up the phone sitting next to him on the side table and called his personal bank manager at his home. He asked the manager to calculate exactly how much physical cash the central bank vaults could mobilize and withdraw by the next morning without triggering international regulatory alarms. The manager ran the numbers and told him they could only physically gather about 1 billion Hong Kong dollars in that short amount of time. Li Ka-shing put the phone down and told Chung the absolute limit was 1 billion. Chung nodded his head, took a slow sip of the hot tea, and accepted the counteroffer. And the physical logistics of moving 1 billion Hong Kong dollars in cash are incredibly complex. It was equivalent to roughly 130 million United States dollars. It was not something you could put in a standard briefcase or a duffel bag. It was literally massive, heavy pallets of paper. The very next day, Li Ka-shing's banking executives began emptying the central vaults. They packed the banded stacks of large denomination bills into heavy canvas bags. They loaded the bags into the back of several armored transport trucks, drove them directly to the Deepwater Bay mansion, and unloaded the bags right into the living room. Cheung arrived at the house, driving a massive, heavy-duty utility van. He parked it right in front of the doors. He personally loaded the heavy canvas bags into the back of his van. The van was so heavily weighed down by the sheer mass of the paper money that the rear suspension visibly sagged toward the pavement. Cheung got in the driver's seat and drove away. And a few hours later, Victor Li was released on a quiet street, completely unharmed. The Li family completely absorbed the massive ransom as a business expense. They drastically upgraded their private security, and they completely refused to report the kidnapping to the Hong Kong police. There was no formal investigation, and there were no warrants issued. And Cheung took his massive, record-breaking ransom straight back to the VIP tables in Macau. He lived in absolute unprecedented luxury. He bought fleets of expensive sports cars, he stayed in massive penthouse suites, and he gambled relentlessly. And within 12 months, he managed to lose almost every single dollar he had extorted from the Li family. So, in September of 1997, Cheung simply reset his operation. He targeted Walter Kwok, and Walter was another one of the absolute wealthiest men in Hong Kong, running a massive, highly successful real estate empire. Walter's car was ambushed on a quiet road in the exact same manner. The armed men surrounded his vehicle, dragged him out, blindfolded him, and took him to a remote village house. But Walter refused to cooperate. When Chung demanded that Walter call his wife to ask for the ransom money, Walter flatly refused. He told Chung he would not give him a single dollar. So Chung took a completely different, highly aggressive approach. He had his men build a heavy wooden box. It was incredibly small, barely large enough for an adult man to sit inside with his knees pulled up to his chest. They stripped Walter down to his underwear, forced him into the wooden box, and nailed the heavy lid shut. They poked a few small holes in the wood for air, and they left him inside that dark, cramped box for 6 straight days. They fed him a few pieces of roast pork and a small amount of water once a day. Walter was completely isolated in the dark, unable to stretch his legs, unable to stand, and forced to sit in his own waste. On the 6th day, the intense psychological and physical pressure finally broke him. He agreed to make the phone call. His wife negotiated directly with Chung, and she eventually arranged a drop of 600 million Hong Kong dollars in physical cash. Walter was finally released, highly traumatized by the confinement, but alive. Now Chung truly believed he had officially defeated the system. He knew that under the strict judicial laws of Hong Kong, the police could not formally charge him with a major crime unless the primary victims came forward and testified in open court. And he knew with absolute certainty that the billionaires valued their pristine corporate reputations and their privacy far too much to ever sit on a public witness stand. He considered his syndicate completely untouchable. In late 1997, the sovereignty of Hong Kong was officially handed over from the British government back to China, and Chung decided to expand his power even further. He arranged to purchase an absolutely massive amount of high explosives from the black market. He coordinated a complex smuggling operation and successfully moved over 960 kilograms of heavy explosives into a storage facility right in Hong Kong. Intelligence sources suspected he was planning to bomb key government buildings to force the release of several of his criminal associates who had recently been arrested on lesser charges. But the Hong Kong police got a tip from an informant. They raided the storage facility and seized the massive cache of explosives before Cheung could load them into vehicles. Cheung realized the police were actively hunting him for domestic terrorism, so he immediately fled across the border into mainland China. He assumed he could just disappear into the massive, densely populated industrial cities of Guangdong province. He deeply believed that even if he was somehow caught, the mainland authorities would have to navigate a highly complex, incredibly slow extradition process to send him back to Hong Kong for trial. But Cheung made a massive, catastrophic miscalculation about exactly how the mainland judicial system operated. The mainland Chinese police did not care about the jurisdictional red tape of Hong Kong. They monitored his communications, and in January of 1998, they tracked him to a small, quiet hideout in the city of Jiangmen. They did not wait for extradition paperwork or build a long case file. Heavily armed tactical units simply surrounded the building, kicked the front doors completely off the hinges, and arrested Cheung along with 36 other members of his syndicate. Cheung was placed in a heavy mainland detention center. He immediately hired the most expensive, highly connected lawyers he could find. The lawyers filed massive amounts of paperwork, desperately trying to get Cheung legally extradited back to Hong Kong. Because under Hong Kong law, there was no capital punishment. The absolute maximum sentence he would face was a long prison term. But the mainland courts completely rejected the extradition requests. They stated that because Cheung had actively plotted crimes that crossed the border, they had full legal jurisdiction to try him right there in Guangdong. And the trial moved incredibly fast. There were no long, drawn-out jury deliberations. The prosecutors presented the clear physical evidence of the explosives, smuggling the detailed records of the cross-border kidnappings and the massive scale of his syndicate operations. In early December of 1998, the Guangdong Provincial Higher People's Court officially found Cheung Tse-kung guilty on all major charges. He was formally sentenced to death. He filed a desperate final appeal to the highest courts, but it was immediately struck down. And on the morning of December 5th, 1998, the man who had casually walked into the home of Asia's wealthiest billionaire with military explosives strapped to his chest to calmly negotiate a world record, ransom over a cup of hot tea, was transported to a secure execution ground. He was lined up with the senior members of his syndicate, and he was executed by a firing squad. And while walking straight through the front doors of a heavily guarded mansion with explosives strapped to your chest is a massive, highly visible threat. Sometimes the most devastating disasters do not announce themselves at all. Sometimes they start completely out of sight, hidden behind the ceiling panels high above your head, starting with a tiny, completely unnoticeable spark of electricity. On the evening of September 2nd, 1998,